Chapter 2254. The Rakshasa sect leader, Roten, suddenly locked his gaze on Nyetion. His eyes were cold and murderous. If not for Jun Chujian's presence, he might have attacked Nyetion directly. Nyetion smiled faintly. Of course, he knew who the son Roten was talking about was. He did not panic. Instead, he raised his brows and said, "Is that your son? I thought it was your daughter." Jun Ouching had told Nyetion that Luo Sanfeng was the son of the Rakshasa sect leader. Therefore, the son that Roten was talking about must be Luo Sanfeng. "Brat, you're courting death." When Roten heard Nyetion's words, he was instantly enraged. With a roar, he struck out with his palm. An extremely violent palm force surged towards Nyetion. He knew what kind of person Luo Sanfeng was, but what he hated the most was people calling the latter a woman. Nyetion's words poked right into his sore spot. How could he not be enraged? The violent palm caused the space to tremble violently as though it was about to be torn apart. When Nyetion sensed the huge murderous intent coming towards him, his eyes flickered slightly. However, he did not panic. With his strength, it was obvious that he would not be able to fight against Roten. If it was just him, regardless of whether he resisted or not, the result would be the same. He would definitely die. However, he had Jun Chujian by his side. The latter would definitely not let anything happen to him. "Roten, how dare you?" As expected, Jun Chujian let out a low growl and stretched out his hand. An invisible force appeared and dissolved the violent palm energy in the air like a spring breeze and rain. When Roten saw Jun Chujian make a move, he took a step forward and stared coldly at the latter. He was extremely angry. "Roten, you know that Nyetion is my guest, yet you attacked him in front of me. Are you looking down on me?" Jun Chujian growled cold and stared at Roten. Roten's face darkened. He seemed to be thinking about something and did not say a word. "Roten, I'm asking you a question." Jun Chujian growled again. There was a faint sword intent surging around him. He was obviously really angry. "I dare not." Roten lowered his head and replied. However, his tone was obviously filled with unwillingness and anger. "You'd better not." Jun Chujian frowned and said coldly. Then, he didn't say anything else. Nyetion looked at the two of them and could not help but feel worried. It seemed that the relationship between the 7 major sword sects of the Sacred Heaven Sword Alliance was more tense than he had imagined. Luo Tong was a member of the 7 major sword sects. Even if he was a sect master, he should still show respect when he saw Jun Chujian, the alliance master. However, in front of Jun Chujian, not only was he not respectful, but he was also very arrogant. He even dared to attack in front of Jun Chujian. Nyetion could not understand and was very puzzled. He admitted that Roten was very strong. Even if he was not as strong as the 3 legendary swordsmen, the gap should not be too big. However, Jun Chujian's strength should be above Anya Minjia and the others. He could definitely crush Roten. The contrast in strength, coupled with the difference in status. Why did Jun Chujian tolerate Roten's arrogance? Jun Chujian indeed looked calm, but since he became the Sword Alliance master, he was, of course, very shrewd. How could a person in a high position be a soft-hearted person? There must be a reason why Jun Chujian tolerated Roten. "Roten, you just said that Nyetion injured your son. What's going on?" Jun Chujian looked at Roten and asked with a frown. "This brat injured my 3rd son, Luo Sanfeng." Roten pointed at Nyetion and said in a deep voice, Jun Chujian frowned and seemed very surprised. He turned to look at Nyetion and asked, "Nyetion, you and Luo Sanfeng don't know each other. Why did you two fight?" "Let him speak for himself." Nyetion smiled coolly and looked over at the 2 figures approaching from behind Roten. One of them was Luo Sanfeng, clad in a flirtatious pink dress. Luo Sanfeng walked over leisurely, and beside him was a burly man who looked somewhat similar to him, but was even more boorish, exuding an extremely wild aura. This burly man was Luo Sanfeng's 2nd brother, Luo Eru. Luo Sanfeng had mentioned Luo Eru in the past, and the latter had said that he would never marry anyone but Jun Ouching. Sanfeng, you speak. Luo Tong said heavily when he saw Luo Sanfeng. Yes. Luo Sanfeng nodded. There was still a scar on her mouth. The wound on his mouth had been inflicted by Nie Tian's sword will. Even a late paramount god like him would need several days to heal. League Lord. Luo Sanfeng bowed slightly to Jun Chujian, then glared venomously at Nie Tian. Not long ago, I came looking for Miss Ouching. I only spoke a few words with her, and this brat found me an eyesore, so he ambushed me. He was very vicious. He used his sword will to rip my mouth open. His sword will is very strong. Even now, my mouth still hasn't healed. With that, Luo Sanfeng glared venomously at Nie Tian. Nie Tian couldn't help but shake his head and smile, but he didn't say anything. Luo Sanfeng, you said he ambushed you and ripped your mouth open. Jun Chujian frowned and asked in a cold voice, then tell me, why didn't you fight back? Luo Sanfeng had a reputation for being a weirdo, but he wasn't a pushover. If what he said was true, how could he not fight back? Luo Sanfeng was stunned for a moment, then said, League Lord, Miss Ouching said that this brat was invited by you to break the sacred heavenly sword seal. How could I dare to hurt him? Oh, Jun Chujian frowned and said, it seems that you're giving me face, so you didn't fight back. Is that right? Yes, that's right. Luo Sanfeng nodded heavily, looking very certain. At this time, Jun Chujian looked at Nie Tian and asked, Nie Tian, do you have anything to say? Nie Tian laughed. Then he fixed his gaze on Luo Sanfeng, a cold light shining in his eyes. Luo Sanfeng couldn't help but tremble when he felt the coldness in Nie Tian's eyes. He subconsciously took a few steps back. He had already seen how powerful Nie Tian was, so he was very afraid of the latter. Luo Sanfeng, I heard that you have a fart mouth and like to fart with your mouth. The more you fart, the louder it is. Nie Tian's mouth twitched as he laughed and said in a cold voice, it seems that you haven't remembered the previous lesson. What? Do you want me to tear the other half of my mouth? As the cold voice fell, Luo Sanfeng was so frightened that she retreated again, her eyes filled with terror. Nie Tian didn't explain anything because he didn't want to. Luo Sanfeng's words just now were full of loopholes. It was fine to deceive a child, but to deceive Jun Chujian, it was simply a joke. League Lord, look at how arrogant this brat is. He dares to threaten me in front of League Lord. He simply doesn't put League Lord in his eyes. Luo Sanfeng calmed down and pointed at Nie Tian. Chapter 2255. Luo Sanfeng suddenly sensed the anger in Jun Chujian's eyes. His body trembled, and he almost fell. Leader, you don't believe me? His teeth were chattering, and his eyes were flickering. He was obviously panicking. Believe you? Jun Chujian laughed instead and roared angrily. Luo Sanfeng, do you think I'm a 3-year-old child? The one who doesn't respect me isn't Nie Tian, it's you. I know very well what kind of person you are. If it's really as you said, you're already being merciful by not killing Nie Tian. How could you let him go? In my opinion, you provoked him, but you're no match for him, so he injured you. After that, Jun Chujian's eyes were extremely cold, and his body was releasing a cold aura. What Luo Sanfeng said just now was simply an insult to his judgment. Of course, he knew that the reason why Luo Sanfeng dared to talk nonsense was because of Roten's instruction. The father and son from the Luo family were simply provoking him, the leader of the Sword Alliance. Leader this. Luo Sanfeng could see that Jun Chujian was really angry. His forehead was covered in sweat, and he couldn't help but turn a look at Roten. Leader, it's fine if you don't believe my son's words. Is there a need to be so angry? Roten said coldly. His attitude was very Roten. Jun Chujian's face darkened. He looked at Roten with restrained anger in his eyes and said in a deep voice, Roten, what do you want? Roten sneered and then locked his eyes on Nie Tian. He said, I don't care what the truth is, but it's true that my son was injured. It's a great humiliation that his mouth was torn open. This humiliation doesn't just belong to him. It belongs to the Luo family and the entire Rakshasa sword sect. You've humiliated the Rakshasa sword sect. If you don't give me an explanation, I won't let this matter rest. After he finished speaking, Roten's expression became extremely gloomy, and his attitude was overbearing and arrogant. When Yetian heard Roten's words, he couldn't help but frown. He did not expect that this person, as the leader of a sect, would speak without boundaries. No wonder Luo Sanfeng was so good at farting. It seemed that her father, Roten, had taught her well. Yetian injuring Luo Sanfeng was originally just a small matter. However, Roten refused to let go of this matter. He even publicly slandered Yetian, saying that he had humiliated the Rakshasa sword sect. When Yetian beat up Luo Sanfeng, he didn't even know what the Rakshasa sword sect was. How could he talk about humiliation? This Roten was obviously trying to pin a big crime on Yetian. Humiliating the Rakshasa sword sect, this crime is really not bad. Yetian smiled faintly and said, I originally thought that Luo Sanfeng was the only one with a fart mouth. Only now do I know that this fart mouth is actually the power of bloodline passed down from father to son. An indifferent voice resounded through the air. It was as if many resounding slaps had landed on Luo Tong's face. Damn, brat, what did you say? Luo Tong roared. He was like a wild beast that was about to go berserk. His eyes turned scarlet red. He never thought that Yetian would be so daring to directly insult him in his face. Who was he? He was the leader of the Rakshasa sword sect. Even Jun Chujian did not dare to insult him in his face. Who did Yetian think he was? He was just a reckless junior. Why did he have to insult him? I said that you're the same as Luo Sanfeng, with a fart mouth. Nie Tianling said coldly without the slightest fear. Little bastard, you're courting death. In an instant, Roten was completely enraged. His whole body surged with a terrifying sword momentum. His figure suddenly moved, and the mountain-like sword momentum slashed directly at Yetian. The sword momentum shook the sky, and its power was unparalleled. Before it landed, the ground could not bear it and directly cracked. Yetian felt a very terrifying pressure, as if there was a force of 10,000 caddies above his head, causing him to let out a groan. Stop! At this critical moment, Jun Chujian let out a roar and took a step forward. A continuous sword momentum surged out like an endless sea wave. The sword intent that had been suppressing Yetian was instantly shattered by the impact. Yetian suddenly felt the pressure disappear. He took 2 steps back and spat out a mouthful of dirty blood. His tense expression improved a lot. Roten, pay attention to your status. Jun Chujian saw that Yetian was injured, and his face immediately darkened. He said cold, Yetian is someone that I invited. If you dare to attack him again, don't blame me for being ruthless. His deep voice carried an extremely strong, murderous aura. This time, Jun Chujian was really angry. Roten attacked Yetian again and again in front of him. This was not only a threat to Yetian, but also a disrespect to him, the leader of the Sword Alliance. As the leader of the Sword Alliance, Jun Chujian's dignity was naturally inviolable. Even if he could tolerate Roten, there was a limit. If Roten dared to challenge his tolerance again, he would be forced to turn against him. Roten was forced to retreat again and again. His face was flushed red, and there was finally a trace of fear in his eyes when he looked at Jun Chujian. He seemed to have not expected that Jun Chujian's strength was actually so strong that it exceeded his expectations. After being intimidated by Jun Chujian's strength, Roten calmed down a lot. However, he did not want to stop just like that. He said, Leader, even if this kid is someone that you invited, you can't just let the matter of him humiliating my Rakshasa sword sect go like this. Before Jun Chujian could speak, Yetian took a step forward and asked cold, Sect Leader Luo, what do you want? He was a little regretful now. If he knew that Roten was so shameless, he would have just killed Luo Sanfeng. But now this matter was actually caught by Luo Tong, and he refused to let go no matter what. It's very simple. Roten sneered and said directly, Since you tore my son's mouth, then an eye for an eye. Let him tear your mouth too. As for your humiliation of the Rakshasa sword sect, I'll let you kneel in front of me and kowtow 100 times to show your remorse. When Yetian heard Roten's words, his eyes narrowed, and he could not help but sneer. If not for Roten's sinister face, he would have thought that this guy was joking. This condition of Roten was really ruthless. Not only did he want to tear Nietion's mouth, but he also wanted him to kowtow and apologize. These conditions were all a naked insult to a martial artist and a swordsman. Who did he think Nietion was? A little lamb that was at the mercy of others? Sect leader Luo, I think you don't understand the situation at all. Nietion's face darkened, and he said coldly, Luo Sanfeng was indeed injured by me, but that's because I have the strength. Do you think that with Luo Sanfeng's strength, he really has the qualifications to provoke me? Let me tell you, I'm already being extremely lenient by not killing him just now. Tearing his mouth was just to give him a warning. If I really wanted to make a move, he would have long ended up without a corpse left. Chapter 2256. Nietion's eyes were as cold as ice as he glared at Luo Sanfeng, looking like a vicious wolf staring at a little lamb. Luo Sanfeng's eyes widened, and she swayed back and forth, cold sweat pouring down her back. She had long since experienced how strong Nietion was, and knew full well how strong he was. Considering how strong he was, trying to make a move against Nietion would be like looking to die. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that if Nietion simply stood there, he wouldn't even have the courage to make a move. You don't dare to make a move, Sanfeng? When Luo Tong saw Luo Sanfeng's little appearance, he was so scared that his little face turned pale. He couldn't help but let out a low roar, his expression gloomy. Never could he have guessed that Luo Sanfeng would be so afraid of Nietion that she didn't even have the courage to make a move. He was very confused. Was Nietion really that terrifying? He had long since realized that Nietion was only an early paramount god, and his Tao of the Sword was only at the mid-level of sword martial unity. Furthermore, he had only just broken through. Compared to Luo Sanfeng, that level of strength was several levels lower. Given the circumstances, why would Luo Sanfeng be so afraid of Nietion? Could it be that Nietion was so strong that he could crush Luo Sanfeng? Roten obviously didn't believe that Nietion was strong enough to do that. Chuckling cold, he said, So you're not going to admit defeat, boy? Sorry, Nietion, can do anything but never admit defeat. Nietionling laughed wildly. Roten's expression darkened, and he was just about to say something when he suddenly sensed something and looked up into the sky. What an arrogant brat! In the next moment, a deep voice was heard in the void, and a black-robed figure descended from the sky. He was middle-aged, tall, and slender, with delicate features that made him seem a bit sickly. However, his aura was so strong that he was actually on the same level as Roten's. Brother Ling, you really came at the right time, Roten said, clasping his hands in greeting. Ling Yi, Jun Chujian, looked at that person and frowned. He thought to himself, he is here too. The newcomer was none other than the sect lord of the Cloud Sword sect, Ling Yi. Then, two more figures appeared and landed beside Ling Yi. Another one to settle scores. Nietion couldn't help but chuckle bitterly to himself. He was very familiar with one of the two. It was Ling Hanfeng, whose ear had been cut off by him. The person next to Ling Yi looked a bit like him, and was most likely his brother. Nietion's guess was correct. The person standing beside Ling Hanfeng was none other than his second brother, Ling Hanqing. Alliance Master. Ling Yi still had some manners. He first smiled slightly, bowed slightly to Jun Chujian, and greeted him. Sect Lord Ling, Jun Chujian said, smiling and bowing to Jun Chujian. Jun Chujian smiled faintly, his gaze sweeping across Ling Hanfeng's body, noticing the latter's ears that had yet to fully recover. He immediately guessed that Ling Ye's ears were also Nietion's work. He didn't expect Nietion to offend the two strongest sword sects the moment he came to the Sacred Heaven Sword Alliance. Sect Lord Ling, to be honest, I'm here to seek justice for my son. Ling Yi smiled and locked his gaze on Nietion. Brat, you're really arrogant, he said coldly. Sect Lord Ling, you don't have to say anymore. Nietion smiled and didn't want to listen to Ling Ye's nonsense. I was the one who cut off Ling Ye's ears. If you want to stand up for your son, come. But I have to remind you that Sect Lord Luo has already tried. If you want to make a move against me, you have to see if Sect Lord Ling is willing. Ling Ye's expression darkened. Nye Tian's arrogant attitude was out of his expectations. He turned to look at Roten and noticed the cracked ground under his feet. He immediately understood everything. It seemed that for Nye Tian, Jun Shujian and Roten really fought. After thinking for a while, Ling Yi smiled and said, "Brat, you're looking down on me too much. I'm the sect master. Why would I make a move against a junior?" Ling Ye's words made Roten's expression darken. Ling Yi noticed Roten's expression but didn't care. He continued to look at Nye Tian and said, "Brat, you injure my son. I can't just let this go. Since this is a matter between you juniors, I won't make a move. I'm not an unreasonable person, and you just said that you won't give in. Then we'll deal with this matter in the most direct way." As he spoke, a faint smile appeared on Ling Ye's face. He then looked at his second son, Ling Hanxing, and said, "You fight with him. No matter what the result is, I will not pursue this matter any further. How about it?" Nye Tian's eyes flickered when he heard Ling Ye's words. He didn't think that Ling Yi would be so straightforward. He didn't ask what happened and didn't care how Ling Hanfeng was injured. He directly suggested that Nye Tian and Ling Hanxing fight. After the fight, no matter what the result was, this matter would be over. Nye Tian liked such a straightforward way of dealing with it. Sure. Without any hesitation, Nye Tian agreed. He didn't even look at Ling Hanxing's strength. Jun Shujian's eyes trembled when he heard Nye Tian agree. He knew how terrifying Ling Hanxing was. He wanted to stop the fight, but he didn't make it in time. Ling Hanxing was Ling Ye's second son. Among the younger generation of swordsmen in the Sacred Heavensword Alliance, he could squeeze into the top 5. Nye Tian was indeed a talented swordsman, but he was too weak. Was he really confident in fighting Ling Hanxing? Straightforward. Ling Yi laughed, but his eyes flickered with a cold light. "Brat, I'll kill you." At this moment, Ling Hanxing took a step forward and said coldly. The cold curve on his lips made him look extremely sinister, as if he was a devil that walked out of hell. Only now did Nye Tian really observe Ling Hanxing. His divine sense swept over the latter, but his expression didn't change at all. Ling Hanxing was a late-stage supreme god, at the peak of the unity of sword and martial arts. He didn't seem to be much stronger than Ling Hanfeng. However, the aura around him was even colder, making people feel a bone-piercing coldness. "I'll wait and see," Nye Tian replied with a faint smile. "No." However, at this moment, a berserk voice rang out. Then, a figure stepped forward and stood in front of Nye Tian. He pointed at him and said in a loud voice, "This brat is mine. Only I can kill him." Nye Tian's eyes narrowed. Looking at the burly figure in front of him, he couldn't help but laugh and tease. "Are you sure you want to kill me?" The person in front of him was a little unexpected to Nye Tian. It was Luo Sanfeng's second brother, Luo Eru. Luo Eru hadn't said a word since he appeared, but now he stood out as if he was very angry and wanted to eat Nye Tian alive. Nye Tian was a little baffled because he could tell that Luo Eru wasn't the kind of person who valued brotherhood. Moreover, when Luo Sanfeng was trembling in fear at Nye Tian, Luo Eru had an indifferent expression. Luo Eru clearly didn't want to kill Nye Tian because of Luo Sanfeng. Chapter 2257. Eru, second brother. When Roten and Luo Sanfeng saw Luo Eru suddenly speak, they both exclaimed. Obviously, they were also very surprised. "Luo Eru, what do you want to do?" Ling Hanxing obviously didn't want to, so he coldly asked. Luo Eru turned around and glanced at Ling Hanxing and said, "Ling Hanxing, you're not the only one who wants to kill him. I, Luo Eru, came here first. If we want to fight, it should be me first, not you." Ling Hanxing frowned. His eyes swept over Luo Sanfeng and couldn't help but laugh and said, "What? Do you want to avenge your third brother?" Luo Eru coldly smiled and said, "His life and death has nothing to do with me. I want to kill this kid because he and Jun Aoqing are too close." Jun Aoqing. When Nye Tian heard this name, he couldn't help but frown and immediately understood. Luo Sanfeng once said that Luo Eru wouldn't marry anyone unless it was Jun Aoqing. Luo Sanfeng must have said something to Luo Eru, so the latter thought that there was something between Nie Tian and Jun Aoqing, so he wanted to kill Nie Tian. So it's for Jun Aoqing. Ling Hanqing laughed, and then said, "Okay, since that's the case, I'll let you do it this time. I'll let you fight with this kid first. If he can survive in your hands, then I'll kill him." "Umph." Luo Eru sneered, and his eyes were incomparably cold, and said in a deep voice, "In my hands, there will never be a survivor." "I hope so." Ling Hanqing slightly smiled, with a strange look on his face. Nie Tian looked at these two people, and couldn't help but bitterly smile in his heart. These two guys seemed to treat him as a little loach that could be trampled on at will. "Kid, you shouldn't be so close to Jun Aoqing." Luo Eru's eyes turned to Nie Tian and coldly said, "Because she is my woman." Nie Tian shook his head with a disdainful smile. He had originally thought that Ling Hanfeng was already shameless enough, but he had never thought that Luo Eru would be even more shameless than him. "Luo Eru, don't speak nonsense. This lady has nothing to do with you." Right at this moment, a clear voice resounded. Then a figure appeared. It was Jun Aoqing. Aoqing. When Luo Eru saw Jun Aoqing appear, his eyes couldn't help but tremble, both of them shining brightly. "Luo Eru, aren't you being too nosy?" However, Jun Aoqing's reaction was cold and angry. She said, "Who I'm close to and who I am far from is my own business. It has nothing to do with you." "Aoqing." In front of Jun Aoqing, Luo Eru completely lost his mind. He was no longer as arrogant and domineering as before. He was so nervous that he couldn't even speak. "Luo Eru, this lady likes to be close to Nie Tian. What are you going to do about it?" At this moment, Jun Aoqing suddenly took 2 steps forward and came to Nie Tian's side. She suddenly hugged the latter's arm and said. Nie Tian was shocked. He looked at Jun Aoqing in shock. He didn't expect the latter to do this. Luo Eru was stunned by the scene in front of him. His mouth was wide open, but he couldn't say a word. "Aoqing, that's enough." Jun Chujian couldn't stand it anymore and reprimanded in a low voice. Only then did Jun Aoqing let go of Nie Tian. She raised her chin and looked proud. Nie Tian shook his head, speechless. Luo Eru already hated him to the extreme, and now Jun Aoqing did this again. Luo Eru's hatred for Nie Tian was as deep as the sky and as deep as the sea. "Brat, you're dead meat." Luo Eru's eyes were as red as blood. He glared at Nie Tian and said coldly. Nie Tian smiled and said, "If you want to kill me, do it on the battle stage." Then everyone was about to go to the battle stage, but Jun Chujian stopped them. "Lord Alliance Head, don't you think it's too late to stop their battle now?" Ling Yi faintly smiled as he looked at Jun Chujian. Jun Chujian frowned and said, "I won't stop their battle, but there are some things that need to be done before the battle." "What things?" Roten and Ling Yi were stunned and asked at the same time. "Don't worry, let's wait in the hall first." Jun Chujian said cold, then stepped forward and entered the Holy Heaven Hall. Ling Yi and Roten looked at each other and finally followed him into the hall. Since the battle had been decided, there was no need to rush. Everyone entered the Holy Heaven Hall and sat down. Jun Chujian didn't say anything and just asked everyone to wait. About half an hour later, many figures appeared outside the hall. "It's the other sect masters." Roten and Ling Yi couldn't help but be surprised when they saw those people. They didn't expect that Jun Chujian would gather all the sect masters of the other sections. After a while, a dozen figures entered the hall and sat down. Nie Tian noticed that among the dozen or so people, 4 of them had very powerful auras. Although they were slightly weaker than Luo Tong and Ling Yi, they weren't that much weaker. He guessed that these 4 people should be the sect masters of the other sects. In this way, the sect masters of the 7 great sword sects of the Holy Heaven Sword Alliance were all present. Jun Chujian wasn't only the Holy Heaven Sword Alliance's alliance master, but also the sect master of the Holy Heaven Sword sect. Originally, the Holy Heaven Sword Alliance was established under the initiative of the Holy Heaven Sword sect. The Sword Alliance master had always been the sect master of the Holy Heaven Sword sect. But in the recent hundreds of thousands of years, the Holy Heaven Sword sect's talents had withered, especially the middle generation. Apart from Jun Shujian, the Holy Heaven Sword sect didn't have any outstanding experts. Because of this, the other sects were eager to replace the Holy Heaven Sword sect and become the orthodox Holy Heaven Sword Alliance. Among the 7 great sword sects, the Rakshasa Sword sect and the Soaring Cloud Sword sect were the most powerful. They even overshadowed the Holy Heaven Sword sect. Roten and Ling Yi had been coveting the position of Sword Alliance Master for a long time. Although Jun Shujian was powerful, he was old and reaching the limit of his life. He couldn't hold on for much longer. The other sects were waiting for Jun Shujian to fall. At that time, they could take advantage of the situation. Jun Aoqing was the most talented person in the Holy Heaven Sword sect in the past hundreds of thousands of years. It was a pity that she was too young. Jun Shujian wanted to nurture Jun Aoqing, but he didn't have the energy to do so. Jun Shujian knew that if he fell, the Holy Heaven Sword Alliance's 7 great sword sects would definitely have internal strife. This could very well lead to the decline of the Holy Heaven Sword Alliance. He really didn't want to see the Holy Heaven Sword Alliance decline in his hands. If that was the case, wouldn't Jun Shujian be the Holy Heaven Sword Alliance's sinner? Today, Jun Shujian had gathered the 7 great sword sect masters because of Nie Tian and the Holy Heaven Sword Seal. The Holy Heaven Sword Seal was the most important thing to the Holy Heaven Sword Alliance. If Nie Tian wanted to break the Holy Heaven Sword Seal, he would first need the 7 great sword sect masters' approval. Sect masters, I believe you have already heard. I recently invited a genius swordsman to help the Holy Heaven Sword Alliance break the Holy Heaven Sword Seal. Chapter 2258. Jun Shujian's voice echoed throughout the Elysium Hall. In the next moment, everyone's gaze was focused on Nie Tian, eager to know what was going on. Then, their expressions became strange. They all had a faint smile on their faces, but they didn't say a word. Sect masters, if there's anything you want to say, just say it. Don't hold it in. It's not good for you to keep it to yourself. Nie Tian stood up and smiled. Although the sect masters didn't say anything, he could guess what they were thinking from their expressions. That kind of contemptuous look, that kind of mocking and contemptuous expression, could not deceive anyone. Alliance Lord, forgive me for being blunt, but this kid's talent and strength are too ordinary. There's no way he can break the sacred Heaven Sword Seal. The sect master of the Greenwood Sword sect was the first to speak. His tone was relatively calm. Alliance Lord, you're joking, right? If this kid can break the sacred Heaven Sword Seal, doesn't that mean that the swordsmen of our sacred Heaven Sword Alliance are all trash? The sect master of the Golden Light Sword sect said disdainfully, "Oomph, a piece of trash that's only at the intermediate fusion of sword and martial arts wants to break the sacred Heaven Sword Seal? He's simply humiliating our sacred Heaven Sword Alliance." The sect master of the Sunken Abyss Sword sect sneered and swept his gaze across Nie Tian. He didn't even have the mood to look at the latter. The other sect masters also expressed their opinions, all of which were disdainful towards Nie Tian. Nie Tian had already expected such a scene, so his expression didn't change much. However, he could tell from the reactions of the other sect masters that the relationship between the 7 major sword sects was extremely tense. It was obvious that Jun Shujian, as the leader of the Sacred Heaven Sword Alliance, no longer had much control over the other sword sections. Jun Shujian furrowed his brows. He knew that the other sect masters would object, but he didn't expect them to be so agitated. Before Jun Shujian could say anything, Nie Tian spoke again with a faint smile. "Dear sect leaders, all of you look down on me and think that my strength and talent are trash, right?" The other sect leaders looked at Nie Tian with strange expressions. They had not expected Nie Tian to be so direct. "Brat, your talent and strength are very trash, but your attitude is very arrogant." The Azurewood sect master sneered and said with a look of disdain, "You don't know the immensity of heaven and earth. If you can break the sacred Heaven Sword Seal, I won't be surnamed Jean." The Golden Light sect master was even more disdainful as he laughed loudly. The other sect leaders also roared with laughter, obviously treating Nie Tian as an idiot. Shut up. Abruptly, Jun Ouching stood up and said loudly, "You have no idea how strong Nye Tian is. He once defeated Ling Hanfeng and Luo Sanfeng with one move. Do you still think he's trash?" The other sect leaders were stunned at first, but then they laughed even more wildly. Obviously, they took Jun Ouching's words as a joke. Ling Hanfeng and Luo Sanfeng were quite famous among the younger generation of the Sacred Heavensward Alliance. They were very strong. If Nye Tian defeated the two of them with one move, these sect leaders would not believe it at all. Ling Hanfeng and Luo Sanfeng were at the scene, but at this moment, their faces were tense, and they did not say a word. They would not voluntarily admit that their strength was crushed by Nye Tian. Jun Ouching's little face was tense. She wanted to say something, but was stopped by Nye Tian. Nye Tian directly stepped into the hall and said loudly, "Since the sect leaders don't believe me and think that I'm trash, why don't we make a bet? Sect masters, please choose a young sword artist from your sect to challenge me. As long as I lose, I'll be at your disposal, sect masters. If I win, then give me a chance to break the sacred Heavensward seal. How about it?" His calm voice caused the crowd to roar with laughter. Everyone looked at Nye Tian as if they were looking at an idiot with unscrupulous smiles on their faces, as if Nye Tian was a clown. Boom! Enough! Are you done laughing? At this moment, a loud sound rang out. Jun Chujian's hand fell and directly shattered the chair beside him. He said loudly, "Nye Tian is a guest invited by me, not a clown that you can ridicule as you please. You think that his talent is trash, but I think that he is a sword Dao genius that only appears once in a billion years. If there is someone in this world who can break the sacred Heavensward seal, then this person must be Nye Tian." His voice was like thunder, shocking everyone. Everyone looked at Jun Chujian in horror, their expressions strange and shocked. They didn't understand why Jun Chujian, who had always been steady, would think so highly of Nye Tian. From Jun Chujian's words, Nye Tian was the #1 sword Dao genius that no one had ever seen before or since. Could it be that Nye Tian's talent was something that they couldn't see through? At this time, Ling Ye's voice rang out. "Everyone, since Nye Tian has proposed it himself, and he is willing to accept the challenge from the genius swordsmen of the various sects, then let's fulfill his wish and let him die with a clear understanding." Yes. Then, Roten also stood up and said, "The person that the Rakshasa Sword Sect will send to challenge Nye Tian is Luo Eru, and the Ling Yun Sword Sect will send Ling Hanqing. The other sects can also send one person out." The other 4 sect leaders were stunned when they heard Ling Yi and Roten's words. They didn't expect that Nye Tian was serious. The Rakshasa Sword Sect and the Ling Yun Sword Sect had both sent out challengers, and they were 2 very powerful swordsmen, Luo Eru and Ling Hanqing. Among the young swordsmen of the 7 major sword sects, these 2 were definitely in the top 5 in terms of strength. In that case, the Greenwood Sword Sect will join in the fun and send Mu Fei. The Greenwood Sect leader stood up and said with a chuckle. Then, the other 3 sects also spoke and sent out challengers. Among the 7 major sword sects, except for the Sacred Heavensward Sect, the other 6 sects all sent out challengers. Alliance leader, how do you think the following battles should be carried out? At this moment, Ling Yi smiled darkly and said, "How about we decide the order of the challenges, and then have 1 battle a day?" Yes. Jun Chujian frowned and said, 1 battle a day, and the order of the challenges will be decided based on the combined strength of each sect. We'll start with the challenger from the Greenwood Sword Sect. Luo Eru seemed unhappy at this decision, but he didn't dare to say anything. After all, this was a joint decision of the 7 major sword sections. "Do we start today?" Ling Yi smiled again and asked. "Tomorrow," Jun Chujian said with a gloomy face. He knew that Nye Tian had suffered from Roten's sword aura and was slightly injured. Starting the challenges tomorrow was the best decision. No need, but at this moment, Nye Tian's voice sounded. "Oh, do you have a different opinion?" Ling Yi seemed to have known that Nye Tian would speak, and his lips curled into a cold smile as he asked. "I like the simplicity of it." Nye Tian smiled faintly, his eyes filled with domineering confidence. Let's start today. There's no need to decide the order of the challenges. Let the 6 of them come together. His calm voice fell, but it stunned everyone present. Chapter 22:59. Nietion's voice was not loud, but it was like thunder from the ninth heaven, resounding in everyone's ears. Everyone widened their eyes and stared at Nietion in disbelief, as if suspecting that they had heard wrongly. "Kid, what did you just say?" After a dozen seconds, Ling Yi finally reacted, but he still had some doubts. He was so shocked that even his voice was trembling as he asked. Everyone's eyes trembled violently as they looked at Nietion one after another. Nietion's expression was very calm at this moment, as if nothing had happened. He glanced at everyone and said indifferently, "I said, I like to keep things simple. Let's start the battle today. In order to avoid trouble, there's no need for any order of challenge. Just let all 6 challengers come together." Gulp. Everyone's expression froze, and the sound of throats rolling could be heard. This time, everyone heard it very clearly, very clearly. Nietion was going to accept the challenges of 6 challengers at the same time. In other words, he was in a fight against 6 people alone. The hall was silent for a few seconds again, and then there was a burst of laughter. Everyone laughed and looked at Nietion as if they were looking at an idiot. To them, Nietion's current action was indeed an idiotic move. One person fighting against 6 people at the same time, wasn't he tired of living? A few sect masters felt that Nietion was either a madman or an idiot, because such a thing could only be done by a madman or an idiot. Any normal person would not make such a stupid decision. "Nietion, have you thought it through?" At this moment, Jun Chujian finally spoke. His reaction was relatively calm, and he asked in a deep voice, "Nietion, don't do anything stupid, okay?" Jun Aoqing also spoke. Her little face was very anxious, and she was obviously very worried. She knew that Nietion was very strong, but definitely not strong enough to fight against 6 powerful swordsmen at the same time. The challengers sent by the 6 major swordsmanship sects were all sword geniuses, and none of them were weak. Especially Luo Eru and Ling Hanqing. In Jun Aoqing's opinion, either one of them was no weaker than Nietion. Nietion's sudden words had indeed shocked her greatly. "Alliance Master, I know what I'm doing." Nietion faintly smiled. His gaze swept across Jun Chujian, then fell onto Jun Aoqing. "Jun Aoqing, don't worry, I'm very strong." Jun Aoqing could not help but be stunned when she sensed the overbearing confidence in Nietion's eyes. Her heart involuntarily trembled, as if there was an indescribable warmth surging through her. Nietion had said the same thing once before, when he was fighting against Ling Hanfeng. At that time, Jun Aoqing also didn't believe that Nietion had the ability to defeat Ling Hanfeng. But what happened afterwards greatly shocked her. Now that she heard Nietion say the same thing again, she was inexplicably excited. She vaguely felt that Nietion would bring her an even greater shock. Nietion's current plan was to completely shock everyone. The few sect masters and others didn't think highly of him. They all felt that he was a piece of trash that didn't have the qualifications to stand before the sacred Heavensword seal. Then he would use his actions to tell everyone that he, Nietion, wasn't a piece of trash. The best way to prove himself was to display his ability. But he felt that defeating the challengers of the 6 sects one by one would also be able to display his ability, but it wouldn't be shocking enough. What he wanted to do now was to let these people who looked down on him feel enough shock. He wanted to blind these people's dog eyes. "Kid, you said it yourself. No one forced you." Ling Yi smiled coldly, his eyes flashing with a malicious light. "Don't talk nonsense. Let's go directly to the fighting ring." Nietion laughed, his expression extremely cold and disdainful. How could he not know what Ling Yi was thinking? Ling Yi wanted to kill him. But unfortunately, Nietion, wasn't a soft persimmon that could be bullied by others. After saying that, Nietion directly walked out of the hall. A moment later, everyone came to the outside of the huge arena. Nietion walked at the front and directly walked towards the largest fighting ring. "Nietion, are you really confident?" Jun Ouching quickly followed and asked in a low voice, obviously still a little worried. Niet Tian smiled confidently and said indifferently, "Don't worry, I'm really strong." Jun Ouching nodded her little head and didn't say anything else. Seeing this scene from behind, Luo Eru was so angry that his teeth were chattering. He roared in his heart, "Niet Tian, if I don't kill you with my own hands today, my name isn't Luo Eru." Seeing the woman he liked walking shoulder to shoulder with someone else, this feeling made Luo Eru go crazy. The other challengers also had grim expressions on their faces as they fixed Niet Tian with vicious looks in their eyes. "I'm going." As they were about to enter the arena, Niet Tian smiled at Jun Ouching and then his body moved. He took a step forward and flew up into the sky. Jun Ouching's beautiful eyes flickered with worry and anticipation. She had a feeling that Niet Tian would definitely shock her again. Bang! As soon as Niet Tian landed on the arena floor, he looked over at Luo Eru and the others and shouted, "Get on the arena floor and prepare to die." Luo Eru and the other experts' faces were filled with rage as they dashed forward and surrounded Niet Tian like streaks of light. When the sect lords saw what was happening, they couldn't help but chuckle coldly. "This brat is way too arrogant. I really don't understand where a trifling early paramount god trash like him gets the guts to act so arrogantly. Let him be arrogant for a while. He's going to die anyway, so what's the harm in being arrogant? The way I see it, this brat knows he's going to die, so he's just being arrogant. There's no need to take him seriously. Let's just have some fun." All of the sect masters looked at Niet Tian with disdain in their eyes, which were filled with sarcasm and contempt. Jun Chujian glanced coldly at these sect masters, and the corners of his mouth curled into a strange smile. In truth, he wasn't confident at all. He didn't know what Niet Tian's battle prowess was like. But he knew that if Niet Tian couldn't even defeat these 6 people, then there was no way he could break the sacred Heaven Sword seal. Therefore, this battle was a test for Niet Tian. If Niet Tian died, then Jun Chujian could only express his regret. "Fellow sect lords," at this moment, Niet Tian's arrogant voice sounded from the fighting ring again. "Open your eyes and watch how I defeat these challengers." One had to admit that Niet Tian was very arrogant right now. He didn't want to act like this, but the taunting words of these sect lords really pissed him off. Since they were looking down on Niet Tian had no choice but to show them how arrogant he was. This brat is really tired of living. The sect lords gnashed their teeth in hatred, their eyes glaring at Niet Tian as if they wanted to skin him alive. However, in the next moment, their expressions changed. Chapter 2260. Suddenly seeing the soaring sword aura, the 6 sect leaders' eyes trembled violently at the same time. They all gasped and were stunned on the spot. That terrifying sword aura was released from Niet Tian's body. At this moment, Niet Tian stood on the fighting ring with a circumference of 10,000 meters. His entire body was like a giant sword that could support the heavens and the earth, and his aura was vigorous and vast. The 6 sect leaders obviously didn't expect that Niet Tian could actually release such a terrifying sword aura. Am I seeing things? How can this kid's sword aura be so strong? The sect leader of the Greenwood Sword sect was the first to speak. His expression was incomparably shocked, and even his voice was slightly trembling. This kid is clearly only at the intermediate stage of unity of sword and martial arts. Why is his sword aura even stronger than a swordsman at the peak of unity of sword and martial arts? The sect leader of the Golden Light Sword sect's face muscles twitched, and his facial features stiffened. This kid's sword essence is so terrifying. Among swordsmen of the same level as him, I have never seen a sword essence that is stronger than his. The sect leader of the Wind God Sword sect also spoke, and his eyes were filled with extreme shock. As for Roten and Lingyi, after they came back to their senses, they both looked extremely embarrassed. At this moment, they finally understood why Niet Tian could defeat Luo Sanfeng and Ling Hanfeng. Judging from Niet Tian's sword aura, his battle strength was definitely above Luo Sanfeng and Ling Hanfeng's. These sect leaders were all strong swordsmen. Even if they were 10,000 meters away, they could still clearly feel the strength of Nietion's sword essence. Without a doubt, Nietion's strength far exceeded their expectations. Nietion, you are indeed very strong. Jun Chujin's reaction was completely different from the other sect leaders. The corner of his mouth raised slightly, and his eyes were unable to conceal the blazing passion. He was looking forward to Nietion creating a miracle. Nietion stood on the fighting ring, but he saw everyone's reaction. Are you shocked now? The corner of his mouth twitched. He laughed in his heart and said, the real shock is yet to come. At this moment, the expressions of the 6 swordsmen on the fighting ring changed. The disdain on their faces was replaced by deep fear. Everyone be careful. There's something strange about this kid's strength. Ling Hanxing was the calmest, and also the most cunning. In a loud voice, he said, from now on, we definitely cannot underestimate him. We must treat him as a real opponent. Oomph! Nietion's gaze swept over Ling Hanxing, and the corners of his mouth curled up in a cold arc. He said coldly, now that you know that I'm your true opponent, isn't it too late? Ling Hanxing looked at Nietion and couldn't help but focus his gaze. The latter's gaze actually made him feel an extremely strong threat. The strength that Nietion had displayed was enough for the 6 challengers to take seriously. In particular, the sword intent around Nietion's body was very sharp, as if it contained infinite possibilities. In the next moment, Ling Hanxing's face darkened and he roared, attack! The 6 challengers moved at the same time. 6 sword auras suddenly rose up, like 6 pillars supporting the sky, from the fighting ring. At this moment, even Luo Eru also felt how terrifying Nietion was. He didn't dare to be careless. Is this all you've got? Too weak. Nietion's gaze swept over the 6 people, and the corner of his mouth curled up in a cold and domineering smile. Black runes surged over his body, and the 3 forbidden skills in his body were activated at the same time. The aura around him skyrocketed. 12 heaven slaying sword formation open. Then he roared, and the sword intent surged over his body. In the space around him, there were actually 12 huge sword shadows rising. This! Ling Hanxing and the others were stunned by the scene in front of them. They couldn't help but gasp in shock. Never in their wildest dreams had they ever imagined that Nietion's strength would be so terrifying. That kind of violent aura that was like a dragon surged out, and even the huge fighting platform began to shake along with it. This kid is so scary. The 6 sect leaders who were watching from afar were shocked when they saw the shocking scene on the fighting ring. If the sword aura that Nietion had displayed just now had surprised them, then the 12 huge sword shadows on the fighting ring were enough to frighten them. It was hard to imagine that Nietion's body could burst forth with such terrifying power. Let's attack together and kill him. At this moment, Ling Hanxing's voice sounded. He roared and took the lead to attack. The long sword in his hand rose into the air, and a cold sword shadow whizzed out, blasting towards Nietion. Boom! 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 At the same time, the others also attacked. Several terrifying sword shadows rolled towards Nietion. Facing the joint attack of 6 powerful swordsmen, Nietion was not afraid at all. What was surging in his eyes was a strong desire to fight. Kill! He roared, and the divine demon power in his body rolled out. At the same time, the 12 huge sword shadows around him also rolled up like a huge dragon, surging in the air. In the next moment, the 12 sword shadows actually merged into one, turning into a sword shadow that was nearly 10,000 meters long, like a giant supporting the sky and the earth. Boom! Then the huge sword shadow suddenly shook in the air. Boundless sword essence suddenly surged out, and the surrounding void shook slightly. A dazzling sword light suddenly bloomed, and the brilliance of the sword spread out for 10,000 meters, covering the whole fighting ring. Boom, 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 boom. In the void, there were countless explosions. The sword shadows that rushed towards Nietion were directly shattered by the sword essence around him before they could even get close to him. This Ling Hanxing, Luo Eru, and the other 6 challengers were stunned by the scene in front of them. Their mouths were wide open, but no sound came out. Boom, boom, boom. In the next moment, a series of muffled sounds came from the air. The 6 figures were sent flying back at the same time, drawing 6 bloody trails in the air. At this moment, the eyes of everyone outside the martial arena became dull. Their nerves were stretched taut to the extreme, and the shock in their hearts was perfectly displayed on their faces. Who would have thought that Nie Tian's strength was so terrifying? At this time, the spectators outside the arena were not only Jun Chu Jian and the 6 sect masters, but also countless disciples of the Sacred Heaven Sword sect. Under countless gazes, the 6 figures suddenly fell to the ground, drawing 6 deep, bloody ravines on the ground. The scene fell into a dead silence. The expressions and gazes of the crowd all expressed the same word: shock. Shock, unparalleled shock, indescribable shock. Especially the 6 sect masters. Their stiff, old faces were like blooming chrysanthemums that suddenly withered. They couldn't believe what was happening in front of their eyes. This was something that they had never expected at all. Nie Tian defeated 6 challengers at the same time. Moreover, he defeated all 6 of them in an absolutely crushing manner. Those were 6 late-stage supreme gods who were at the peak of the sword martial union. In their eyes, Nie Tian was just a swordsman with a weak sword Dao. How could he explode with such terrifying power? Before this battle, the result Nie Tian wanted was to blind the eyes of the 6 sect masters. Now, from the expressions of the 6 sect masters. Chapter 2261. Inside and outside the arena, it was silent for a full 10 seconds. During this time, it was as if time and space had stopped. Everyone's eyes were focused on the silver-haired figure on the platform, and their expressions were extremely shocked. Now, who else is not convinced? Nie Tian stood on the platform, his eyes sweeping across everyone as he spoke in a domineering tone. At this moment, he really wanted to ask the 6 sect masters how they felt about this scene. As his domineering voice fell, everyone's eyes trembled, and they finally reacted. The swordsmen of the Sacred Heaven Sword sect looked at Nie Tian with shock and awe. The 6 sect masters looked extremely embarrassed. They looked at each other, not knowing what to say. Outside the fighting ring, the 6 challengers finally made a move. They struggled with great difficulty trying to stand up, but all 6 of them were covered in blood, and their injuries were not light. In the end, except for Luo Eru and Ling Hanxing, who barely managed to stand up, the other 4 could not even get up. At this moment, Luo Eru and Ling Hanxing looked at Nie Tian, no longer with the arrogance and contempt they had before. Instead, it was replaced by fear and wariness. At this moment, they finally realized how big the gap between them and Nie Tian was. Nie Tianling laughed, his eyes sweeping across Luo Eru and the others, not even interested in looking at them. This challenge is over. With a faint smile, Nie Tian's figure moved, and he jumped off the platform in a very elegant manner. At this moment, he was very proud, but he concealed it well. In fact, even he himself did not expect that the 12 heaven-slaying sword array combined with the demon god sword intent would be so terrifying. This was the first time he used the demon god sword intent to form a formation, and the effect was unexpectedly strong. He originally thought that after the 12 heaven-slaying sword array, Luo Eru and Ling Hanxing would definitely still be standing on the platform. To his surprise, Luo Eru and Ling Hanxing could not withstand the impact of the sword formation. Fortunately, he used the 12 heaven-slaying sword array, which was the weakest of the 3 major sword formations of the AO sword technique. If he had used the other 2 sword formations, the 6 challengers would have been killed instantly. Nie Tian did not want to kill the 6 of them. He just wanted to give the 6 sect masters a shock. Nie Tian. Jun Ouching saw Nie Tian coming down from the fighting ring. She moved and welcomed him happily. She didn't expect Nie Tian's strength to be so terrifying. I've said it before, I'm very strong. Nie Tian looked at Jun Ouching and smiled faintly, the corners of his lips curling into an indifferent arc. On the other side, Jun Chujian smiled and said in a clear voice, "Fellow sect leaders, let us return to the main hall first." He could still maintain a calm expression on his face, but only he knew the shock in his heart. He guessed that Nie Tian could defeat 6 challengers. But in his mind, he imagined that Nie Tian would have a Pyrrhic victory. In reality, Nie Tian had crushed all 6 of them. He could even tell that Nie Tian had not used his full strength just now. At this moment, he firmly believed that Nie Tian was the one who could break the sacred Heaven Sword seal. A moment later, everyone returned to the sacred Sky Hall. "Fellow sect leaders, do you have anything else to say?" Jun Chujian's voice sounded, and there was a hint of pride in his hearty voice. The 6 sect leaders looked at each other without saying a word. Not long ago, they had mocked and humiliated Nie Tian in every possible way. However, Nie Tian had used his own strength to slap their faces. It was as if all the mockery and humiliation had been returned to them. Seeing that the 6 sect leaders were silent, Nie Tian smiled faintly and stood up. He said in a loud voice, "I only have one question. Do I, Nie Tian, have the right to stand before the sacred Heaven Sword seal?" His calm voice resounded in the hall, and it was like a loud slap to the faces of the 6 sect leaders. The 6 sect leaders were like eggplants that had been hit by frost, and all of them wilted. Seeing this, Jun ouching covered her mouth. She wanted to laugh, but was too embarrassed to do so. "Fellow sect leaders, you were all very talkative before. Why have you all become mute now?" Nie Tianling laughed arrogantly. The Greenwood sect leader was the first to relent, and he actually used a respectful title for Nie Tian. He stood up and said, "Lord Nie Tian, I acknowledge your right. I also acknowledge Lord Nie Tian's right." The Divine Wind sect leader also stood up and expressed his stance. "I also acknowledge his right." The Golden Light sect leader and the Qinyuan sect leader stood up at the same time and bowed. These sect leaders were all very smart people. Nie Tian's mockery of them was actually nothing much. Their change in attitude towards Nie Tian wasn't because they truly acknowledged Nie Tian, but because they felt that Nie Tian could really break the sacred Heaven Sword seal. As long as the sacred Heaven Sword seal was broken, it would be equivalent to opening the entrance to the sacred Heaven Sword tomb. There were countless Sword Dao inheritances in the sacred Heaven Sword tomb. This was an immeasurable wealth for the 7 major swordsmanship sections. But now, the sect leaders saw hope in Nie Tian to break the sacred Heaven Sword seal. How could their attitude not change? Nie Tian smiled faintly and stopped mocking them. Instead, he looked at Roten and Ling Yi and asked, "Sect leader Luo, sect leader Ling, what do you think?" He knew that enough was enough, and he was really asking for Roten and Ling Yi's opinion. Yes. Roten and Ling Yi looked at each other and nodded at the same time. The 2 of them were smarter than the other sect masters, and they also saw hope in Nie Tian. Very well. When Jun Chujian saw the 6 sect masters nodding their heads, he laughed heartily and said, "Since all the sect masters have acknowledged Nie Tian's qualifications, then I'll let Nie Tian make some preparations. We'll officially head to the sacred sky peak in 7 days." The 6 sect leaders nodded in agreement. Nie Tian smiled faintly in agreement. He had seen the sacred Heaven Sword seal before and felt that it was very strange. He indeed needed to prepare. Jun Chujian nodded and said, "Sect leaders, since you've come to Cloud Valley Sacred Heaven, stay here for the time being. We'll head to Mount Shantian together in 7 days." Yes. The 6 sect leaders bowed. They obviously wouldn't leave at this time. If Nie Tian broke the sacred Heaven Sword seal in advance, and they weren't there, wouldn't they suffer a great loss? Next, the 6 sect leaders left the hall with their respective sections. Soon, only Jun Chujian, Nie Tian, and Jun Ouching were left in the hall. "Ouching, you go first. I have something to say to Nie Tian." Jun Chujian calmly smiled and said to Jun Ouching, "Is there anything you want to say that you can't let me know?" Jun Ouching pouted her little mouth high, very unhappy. "It's nothing." Jun Chujian shook his head helplessly. "If you want to hear it, then stay." Yes. Jun Ouching nodded. The gloomy sky was about to clear up. Nietion looked at Jun Ouching and couldn't help but smile. The latter was indeed still a child. He then looked at Jun Chujian and asked, "Lord, what do you want to say to me?" Chapter 2262. Nietion was stunned when he heard Jun Chujian's words. He hadn't expected that Jun Chujian would actually want to discuss the Sword Dao with him. Right now, I only know the Spirit Realm Sword Dao and the God Realm Sword Dao. Nieton nodded slightly and told him about the Sword Dao realms that he knew. Currently, he knew of two great realms of Sword Dao, the Spirit Realm Sword Dao and the God Realm Sword Dao. The Spirit Realm Dao of the sword had 10 great realms: sword moves, sword techniques, sword chi, sword heart, sword intent, sword force, sword spirit, sword soul, and sword profundity. There were 6 great realms in the godly stage of the Sword Dao: sword marking, sword vein, sword bone, sword essence, sword oblivion, and sword martial unity. In that case, the highest realm of Sword Dao that you know should be the legendary realm of sword and martial arts as one, right? Jun Chujian nodded slightly and smiled faintly. Yes. Nietion nodded. His eyes flickered as he asked, "Alliance leader, there's a higher realm above the godly state sword principle, right?" Since Jun Chujian suddenly talked to him about the Sword Dao realm, it was obvious that he wanted to tell him something. Of course, Jun Chujian chuckled and said, "As the saying goes, martial arts have no limits. The same goes for sword arts. There are indeed better sword principles above the godly state sword principles. In the Forsaken Land, the most talented swordsmen can all reach the legendary realm of sword and martial arts as one. A swordsman with peak talent would be able to reach a whole new realm of the way of the sword that surpasses the fusion of sword and martial arts." Hearing Jun Shujin's words, Nietion's eyes lit up and he asked, "What is the realm of Sword Dao that surpasses the unity of sword and martial arts?" In fact, he already knew that there was definitely a higher realm of the Sword Dao above the unity of sword and martial arts. When he met Anya Minjia and the others before, he clearly felt that the sword intent of these people was stronger than that of the legendary swordsmen, such as Sakura and Firestorm Qianyu. This undoubtedly showed that Anya Minjia and the other sword principles were above the legendary realm. Nietion was a swordsman, and there was no need to doubt his desire to pursue a higher Sword Dao, even though he was still far from the legendary realm. However, understanding a higher realm of the Sword Dao would be greatly beneficial to his future path of the Sword Dao. It could also broaden his horizons of the Sword Dao. Jun Ouching was also very focused at the moment. Obviously, she did not know what the higher realm of Sword Dao was. 3 transcendent realms. Jun Chujian's gaze changed slightly, and his expression became much more serious. He said, "The realm of the way of the sword above the unity of sword and martial arts is known as the 3 realms of transcending God. Transcendent God Level 3. Nietion and Jun Ouching's eyes trembled at the same time, their eyes burning. Seeing their reactions, Jun Chujian nodded and continued. The so-called 3 realms of the transcendent God are 3 realms of the way of the sword that surpass the unity of sword and martial arts. They are the transcendent sword soul, the transcendent sword body, and the transcendent profound." Nietion and Jun Ouching's eyes lit up. The shock in their hearts was written on their faces as they waited for Jun Chujian to continue. The 3 realms of the transcendent God are the foundations of the unity of sword and martial arts. Jun Chujian's eyes were like torches as he said, "Use your own soul to stimulate the sword intent once again, condensing an even stronger sword soul, sword body, and profound. In the Forsaken Land, only those with peak talent in the way of the sword can reach the 3 realms of the transcendent God. I estimate that there are no more than 100 transcendent God swordsmen in the entire Forsaken Land." Nietion's pupils constricted slightly, his expression filled with shock. The Forsaken Land was formed by fragments of the sacred world. It was difficult to estimate how big it was, and it was even more impossible to know how many people there were. There were so many people, but there were less than 100 transcendent God swordsmen. It was obvious how difficult it was to reach this realm. At this moment, Nietion's eyes lit up and he asked excitedly, Alliance leader, have the six sect leaders reached the three realms of the transcendent God? Yes. Jun Chujian nodded with a smile and said, Roten and the others are the sect leaders of the sword sect. Their talent in the way of the sword is naturally very strong. The six of them are all at the transcendent God sword soul realm. Among them, Roten and Ling Yi are the most powerful. They are already at the peak of the transcendent God sword soul realm and should be able to reach the transcendent God sword body realm soon. Nietion nodded slightly and then asked, What about the three legends of the sword world? What are their realms like? Dark Night, Bright Cliff, Light Martial Year of the Phoenix, Sikong Xuani. Jun Chujin's lips curled up, and he said, These three are known as the three legends. Their sword arts have long reached the transcendent God sword body realm. Nietion nodded slightly. He had previously sensed that the sword intent of the six sect leaders was indeed a little weaker than that of the three legends. At this moment, Nietion's eyes trembled slightly, and he could not help but ask, Alliance leader, what about you? He felt that Jun Chujin's sword intent seemed to be stronger than that of the three legends. He was curious as to what level Jun Chujin's cultivation had reached. I'm also at the transcendent God sword body realm, but I'm just a little stronger than the three legends. Jun Chujin seemed to know what Nietion was thinking and said with a faint smile. Nietion frowned. Jun Chujin's strength did not seem to be as strong as he had imagined. He had originally thought that Jun Chujin was already at the transcendent God ultimacy realm. A thought suddenly occurred in Nietion, and he asked, Alliance head, I have a question, but I'm not sure if I should ask it. Go ahead. Jun Chujin smiled calmly. Alliance leader, with your strength, you should be able to crush the six sect leaders. Nietion's eyes narrowed, and he said, I'm very curious. Why did you tolerate Roten, Ling Yi, and the others and let them be so presumptuous in front of you? Nietion had long wanted to ask this question, but he had never found the right opportunity. Nietion had a rough understanding of the relationship between the seven major swordsmanship sects of the Sacred Heaven Sword League. Even if Jun Chujin wanted to stabilize the Sacred Heaven Sword League, he didn't have to use such a weak method. If he faced the six sect leaders with a tough attitude, perhaps the unity of the Sacred Heaven Sword League would be much better. Weakness was the biggest taboo for people in high positions. It was impossible for Jun Chujin not to know this. Nietion, since you've asked, I won't hide it from you. Jun Chujin looked at Nietion, but his face suddenly became much more solemn. Then his figure moved slightly, and a sword intent surged out of his body and condensed into an illusory sword shadow, which actually merged with his body. This is... Nietion was taken aback. He was quite surprised. He had never seen such a scene at all. The sword shadow outside Jun Chujin's body had a very strange aura, as if the sword shadow was Jun Chujin himself and perfectly merged with his body. Nietion, this is the ultimate divine sword body of a divine swordsman, Jun Chujin said in a deep voice, and his eyes flickered as he said, Look carefully, what did you find? Ultimate divine sword body. Nietion's eyes suddenly narrowed. He then forced himself to calm down and carefully sensed the sword shadow outside Jun Chujin's body. In the next moment, he finally found something strange, and his expression suddenly changed as he exclaimed, Crack! He actually found a crack on Jun Chujin's ultimate divine sword body. The crack was very hidden, and if one didn't look carefully, it would be impossible to discover it. Chapter 2263. Nietion looked at the crack on Jun Chujin's legendary sword body and felt a chill run down his spine. Large beads of sweat seeped out of his forehead. It seems like you've seen it. Jun Chujin smiled bitterly when he saw Nietion's reaction and put away the legendary sword body. Nietion sucked in a breath of cold air. Only after long, while did his expression soften. He had never expected that there would be such a huge crack on Jun Chujin's legendary sword body. He could sense an extremely terrifying aura from that crack. That aura was an extremely violent sword intent aura. It was as if the crack on Jun Chujin's legendary sword body was a sword scar. Jun Ouching was also stunned for a long time. She had never expected that her grandfather would have such a serious injury. "Nie Tian, what did you see?" Jun Shujin's expression remained calm as he asked calmly. "Alliance Master, there's a sword scar on your legendary sword body, right?" Nie Tian frowned and asked while holding his breath. "Yes." Jun Shujin let out a long sigh and nodded helplessly. Nie Tian's guess was right. The crack on his legendary sword body was indeed a sword scar. How is this possible? Nie Tian's eyes trembled as he was extremely shocked. He could not imagine who could leave a sword scar on Jun Shujin's legendary sword body. The legendary sword body was formed by a swordsman's soul body as a foundation by stimulating the sword intent. In other words, the legendary sword body was equivalent to a swordsman's second martial body. Moreover, this second martial body was far more powerful than a warrior's own martial body. When Jun Shujian released the legendary sword body just now, Nie Tian could clearly feel its power. To him, the legendary sword body was something that could not be destroyed. Who was it that had such a strong sword intent that it could leave a sword mark on Jun Shujian's transcendent sword body? Jun Shujian was already the strongest swordsman that Nie Tian had ever seen. Could it be that in the Forsaken Land, there was a stronger swordsman than him? Nie Tian, don't ask about the story behind this sword scar. Jun Shujian let out a long sigh and didn't say anything else. Instead, he bitterly smiled and said, "Now you should understand why I tolerated Roden and Ling Ye's impudence." Nie Tian suppressed the shock in his heart and nodded slightly. Nie Tian had seen how terrifying that sword mark was with his own eyes. Because of the existence of this sword mark, Jun Shujian's strength was definitely not as strong as it seemed on the surface. In fact, Nie Tian even felt that if it was a life-and-death battle, Jun Shujian might not be a match for an expert like Anya Minjia. That sword scar had a great restriction on Jun Shujian, and had greatly reduced his battle prowess. Jun Shujian was already an expert with a transcendent sword body. Who could leave such a terrifying sword mark on his transcendent sword body? Could it be that the person who injured Jun Shujian was a swordsman with a transcendent, profound meaning? Since Jun Shujian wasn't willing to say more, Nie Tian didn't ask further. At this moment, Jun Shujian suddenly looked at Nie Tian and said solemnly, "Nie Tian, I actually asked you to break the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal, not only for the Sacred Heaven Sword Alliance, but also for myself." "What do you mean?" Nie Tian was startled and didn't quite understand. Jun Shujian smiled and said, "The Sacred Heaven Sword Seal is the gate that seals the Sacred Heaven Sword Tomb, but it also contains a very powerful sword intent. This sword intent was left behind by the Sacred Heaven Patriarch back then. The Sacred Heaven Patriarch was a very mysterious swordsman. Although I don't know what level his sword Dao had reached back then, I can feel that the sword intent he left behind is very powerful and far superior to mine. If I can obtain the sword intent in the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal, I can heal the sword mark on my transcendent sword physique. If I can obtain the sword intent in the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal, I will be able to heal the sword mark on my transcendent sword physique." At this point, Jun Shujin's eyes couldn't help but reveal a hint of passion. For so many years, he had been suffering from the sword mark on the transcendent sword physique all the time. Even in his dreams, he wanted to heal this sword mark, and the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal was his greatest hope. Nie Tian's eyes trembled slightly, and he immediately understood. It turned out that Jun Shujian wanted to obtain the sword intent in the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal to heal the sword mark on his transcendent sword physique. If Nie Tian broke the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal, not only would he open the Sacred Heaven Sword Tomb for the Sacred Heaven Sword Alliance, but he would also bring a great opportunity to Jun Shujian and even save Jun Shujian's life. It would also bring a great opportunity to Jun Shujian and even save Jun Shujian's life. Nie Tian was very curious if the mysterious person knew about the sword mark on Jun Shujian's body. He was even more curious about the hidden deal between the mysterious person and Jun Shujian. "Nie Tian, the future of the Sacred Heaven Sword Alliance and I is in your hands," Jun Shujian said sincerely. "Alliance Master, Don't worry. I will do my best. Nyetian smiled and nodded. Opening the sacred heaven sword seal would also be of great benefit to Nyetian. Most directly, the entire sacred heaven sword alliance and Jun Shujian would owe him a huge favor. Moreover, once the sacred heaven sword tomb opened, it wouldn't be too much for him to take away a few Sword Dao inheritances. Although he wasn't interested in Sword Dao inheritances, he could give them to the people around him. However, the troublesome thing was that he had no confidence in breaking the sacred heaven sword seal. Previously, when he went to see the sacred heaven sword seal, he felt a boundless pressure before he even got close to it, which made him unable to get closer. Looks like it's going to be very difficult to break the sacred heaven sword seal. Nyetian sighed in his heart with a helpless expression. Nyetian, the sacred heaven sword seal is a great opportunity for you. Just at this moment, Little Fat Cat's voice rang out within his divine sense, carrying an unconcealable excitement. What do you mean? Nyetian heard Little Fat Cat's voice and asked in surprise, his eyes burning with passion. The Fat Cat was a lucky cat. Once it spoke, it would bring good news to Nyetian. So stupid. The Fat Cat chuckled. When the sacred heaven sword seal is opened, the sword intent in the seal will be released. If that old man can absorb the sword intent, you can too. Nyetian was taken aback and speechless. It turned out that the Fat Cat wanted him to absorb the sword intent in the sacred heaven sword seal. The sword intent contained in the sacred heaven sword seal was indeed very powerful. But now, Nyetian didn't even know how to break the seal. Wasn't it a bit ridiculous to say that he could absorb the sword intent? In the next moment, Nyetian's eyes trembled and he suddenly asked, "Little Fatty, have you already thought about how to open the sacred heaven sword seal?" He almost forgot that the Fat Cat was an omniscient existence. Since it mentioned absorbing the sword intent, it must have already thought of a way to break the seal. Of course, the Fat Cat smiled proudly. "I've been thinking about the sacred heaven sword seal, but it's a bit complicated and there might be some trouble." "I'm not afraid of trouble." Nyetian smiled excitedly. As long as he could open the sacred heaven sword seal, he wouldn't be afraid of any trouble. Humph! The Fat Cat let out a strange laugh, and its dark blue eyes glowed with a strange light. "If you want to open the sacred heaven sword seal, you can't do it alone. We'll need the help of the Sword Alliance Master and the 6 Sect Masters." Chapter 2264. You need their help? Nyetian was taken aback by Little Fat Cat's words, his face filled with confusion. Shouldn't he be the one to activate the sacred heaven sword seal? Why would he need help from others? Moreover, the people Fat Cat mentioned were Jun Shujian and the 6 Sect Masters. This lineup was a bit too terrifying. He really couldn't understand what Jun Shujian and the others had to do with activating the sacred heaven sword seal. Nyetian, this matter is a bit complicated and shouldn't be discussed here. Find a place to stay first. Fat Cat smiled and didn't say anything else. Nyetian frowned in confusion. He didn't know what Fat Cat was up to. Then, he bid farewell to Jun Shujian, and the latter asked Jun Ouching to arrange a place for him to stay. After leaving the hall, Nyetian was led by Jun Ouching to a unique courtyard. "Nyetian, you can stay here for a few days. My place isn't far from yours." Jun Ouching smiled sweetly and said, "If you need anything, you can come and find me at any time." "Many thanks," Nyetian said, then turned around and walked into the courtyard. "Idiot! Blockhead!" Jun Ouching couldn't help but frown as she looked at Nyetian's back. However, the latter didn't turn around, so she could only leave helplessly. Nyetian was thinking about what Fat Cat said and didn't pay attention to Jun Ouching at all. He came to the courtyard and went straight into the room. "Little Fatty, what are you planning to do?" After entering the room, Nyetian couldn't wait any longer and asked anxiously. Fat Cat chuckled and came out of the origin embryo space. Its fat body moved and jumped onto Nyetian's shoulder. "Nyetian, you've seen the sacred heaven sword seal. Do you think that in your current state, you can break through the sword seal?" Little Fat Cat frowned and asked with a smile. "I'm not confident." Nyetian shook his head and couldn't help but feel depressed. The sacred heaven sword seal was extremely terrifying and had an unusual aura that Nyetian couldn't understand. He felt that it would be difficult for him to even get close to the sacred heaven sword seal, let alone break it. Nietian, the sacred heaven sword union has been established for so long and has produced countless sword geniuses, but no one has been able to break it. Don't you think it's strange? Fat Cat asked again. Strange. Nietian was stunned for a moment. Then he laughed and asked, those people couldn't break the sword seal. It only means that they are not talented enough. What's so strange about that? The opening of the sword seal was usually a test of the swordsman's sword talent. The fact that the Sacred Heaven Sword Union swordsmen couldn't break, it meant that their sword talent didn't meet the requirements of the Sacred Heaven Sword seal. Is that so? Fat Cat let out a strange laugh and suddenly asked, Nietian, who do you think is stronger, your sword talent or that little girl's? When Nietian heard little Fat Cat's question, he couldn't help but be stunned. Of course, he knew that the little girl Fat Cat was referring to as June Ouching, but he didn't quite understand what Fat Cat meant. It should be me. His eyes flickered and he smiled unconfidently. June Ouching was only 17 or 18 years old, but she was already a mid-stage paramount god. Her sword Dao had even reached the elementary stage of sword and martial unity. One had to admit that her martial Dao and sword Dao talent were shocking. However, Nietian had to admit that his sword intent was far stronger than June Ouching's, and his battle prowess was more than 8 streets ahead of June Ouching. In terms of sword intent and battle prowess, Nietian was indeed much stronger than June Ouching. Ha! The little Fat Cat looked at Nietian and curled its lips into a smile, saying, Nietian, you're really not humble at all. Nietian smiled awkwardly. You're asking me so directly. Do you want me to admit that my talent isn't as good as hers? Fat Cat shook her head. Nietian, your sword intent is indeed stronger than that little girl's, but your sword Dao talent might not be as good as hers. The stronger the sword intent of a swordsman is, the higher their achievements in the sword Dao will be. But that doesn't mean they're talented in the Dao of the sword. From ancient times until now, swordsmen who became grandmasters in the Dao of the sword didn't necessarily have shocking talent, but they did have extraordinary sword intent and tenacious willpower. Fat Cat looked at Nietian and smiled oddly. Your future achievements in the Dao of the sword will definitely be stronger than that little girl's, but your talent in the Dao of the sword won't be as good as hers. Nietian's eyes narrowed. I never would have guessed that June Ouching would be so talented in the Dao of the sword. Of course, Fat Cat said, smiling proudly. Have you ever met an 18-year-old swordsman who can fuse the sword and martial arts into one? No, Nietian said, shaking his head. Then it's settled. Fat Cat looked at him. I'm afraid even your wife with the 3 lives meridians might not be as talented as June Ouching in the Dao of the sword. Nietian smiled bitterly and shook his head. He wasn't too disappointed to know that his talent in the Dao of the sword was not as good as June Ouching's. A swordsman's future achievements weren't determined by their talent in the Dao of the sword alone, but by a combination of various factors. Even Fat Cat said that his future achievements in the Dao of the sword would definitely be above June Ouching's. Therefore, he wouldn't be disappointed at all. But in the next moment, Nietian suddenly thought of something and his expression changed. He looked at Fat Cat and said, Fat, if my talent in the Dao of the sword is below June Ouching's, doesn't that mean I can't break the Sacred Heaven Sword seal? June Ouching's talent in the Dao of the sword was above Nietian's, but she couldn't break the Sacred Heaven Sword seal. Wouldn't it be even more impossible for Nietian? That's not necessarily true. Fat Cat chuckled. I didn't say that the little girl couldn't break the Sacred Heaven Sword seal because she wasn't talented enough. What do you mean? Nietian was stunned and puzzled. If June Ouching was talented enough, she should be able to break the Sacred Heaven Sword seal. But the fact was that she couldn't break the Sacred Heaven Sword seal. Fat Cat's words made Nietian even more confused, and he almost couldn't understand. Nietian, the Sacred Heaven Sword seal doesn't only test the swordsman's talent, but also their strength. Fat Cat smiled faintly. The reason why the little girl couldn't break the Sacred Heaven Sword seal wasn't because she wasn't talented enough, but because she was too weak. Too weak. Nietion's eyes narrowed and his brows furrowed even tighter. Does one need the strength of the Sword Alliance's leader to break the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal? He originally thought that the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal only required the swordsman's talent, but it also required the swordsman's strength. The leader of the Sword Alliance? Fat Cat's lips twitched into a strange arc. Forgive me for being blunt, but I'm afraid that old man's strength is still a bit weak. Still weak? Nietion was taken aback, thinking that he had misheard. The leader of the Sword Alliance, Jun Chu-Jian, was the strongest swordsman he had ever seen. Chapter 2265. Nietion looked at the little fat cat, unable to conceal the shock in his eyes. He even suspected that the fat cat was wrong. Nietion, I'll tell you. The fat cat let out a strange laugh and said, Actually, there's only one condition to activate the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal. As long as this condition is met, the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal will be activated. What condition? Nietion's eyes trembled and became extremely fiery. Sword Intent Resonance. The fat cat's deep blue eyes stared at Nietion and said these 4 words. Nietion's eyes trembled when he heard these 4 words. Then, his expression became stiff, and he couldn't say a word for a long time. He never would have thought that the condition to activate the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal was Sword Intent Resonance. Sword Intent Resonance sounded very simple, but in reality, it was almost impossible to achieve. Not long ago, Nietion and Sikong Xuani had Sword Intent Resonance, but that was only a trick. In order to gain his trust, Sikong Xuani purposely resonated with him. A true Sword Intent Resonance required 2 conditions. First, the 2 swordsmen's sword Dao strength must be similar, and second, the 2 swordsmen's sword intents must be connected. However, the sword intent within the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal was left behind by the Divine Heaven Ancestor. The Divine Heaven Ancestor was a mysterious swordsman, and no one knew what level his sword Dao strength was at. Even Jun Chu-Jian had to admit that his sword intent was far inferior to the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal's sword intent. It was not an exaggeration to say that among all the swordsmen in the entire abandoned land, it was impossible to find a sword intent resonance with the Divine Heaven Ancestor. No wonder the fat cat said that Jun Chu-Jian's strength was still a bit weak. Compared to the Divine Heaven Ancestor's sword Dao strength, Jun Chu-Jian was indeed a weakling. At this moment, from Nietion's point of view, it was impossible to trigger the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal's sword intent resonance. The Sacred Heaven Ancestor set up the sword seal, but he wanted the sword intent to resonate as the condition to open it. This clearly meant that he didn't want others to open the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal. This Sacred Heaven Ancestor is so sinister. Nietion frowned and cursed in his mind. Nietion, do you think that the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal can't be opened at all? The fat cat chuckled and asked playfully. Nietion was stunned for a moment before he reacted. His eyes trembled, and he said in surprise, Fat, you have a way to resonate with the sword intent of the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal. Of course. The fat cat chuckled and said, If I can't do it, why would I bother talking to you? Nietion's expression suddenly relaxed, and he immediately felt carefree, as if he had gone from hell to heaven. Originally, he couldn't see any hope, but Fat Cat gave him the greatest hope. Fat, what are you planning to do? Immediately, Nietion became much colder and asked in a deep voice. The fat cat smiled and said, Sword intent resonance requires only 2 conditions. One is the strength of the sword Dao, and the other is the connection of the sword intent. There is more than one type of sword intent in your body, and it is very flexible. Plus, you have the power of the stars in your body, so you can change the attribute of the sword intent at will. Thus, the connection of the sword intent is very simple for you. Then the last condition is the strength of the sword Dao. Strength of the sword Dao. This is very troublesome. Nietion frowned and said with an awkward expression, His strength of the sword Dao was 800 streets away from the Sacred Heaven Ancestors. They were simply not on the same level. Don't worry. The fat cat smiled and said, Your strength of the sword Tao is indeed a bit lacking compared to the sacred heaven ancestor. However, I have a way to make your strength of the sword Tao become similar. What way? Nietion's eyes slightly trembled as his eyes lit up. Very simple. Increase your strength of the sword Tao. The fat cat revealed a strange smile and said with a proud expression. Nietion was stunned for a few seconds before he said in astonishment, Lil Fei, are you joking? The strength of the sword Tao, especially at the later stages, was very difficult to increase each time. Many swordsmen would go into seclusion for decades, or even centuries, just to increase a small level. The fat cat actually said that he wanted to increase Nietion's strength of the sword Tao. This was a bit funny. Nietion's strength of the sword Tao was at least a few levels lower than the sacred heaven ancestor. How could he increase it? The most important thing was that Nietion's time was very tight. Does it look like I am joking? The fat cat angrily glared at Nietion and said, the increase in strength of the sword Tao that I'm talking about, of course, is not a real increase, but a temporary increase. What do you mean? Nietion asked in shock and was about to die from anxiety. The fat cat calmly said, with your strength of the sword Tao, it definitely cannot be compared to the sacred heaven ancestor. However, if you add that old man and the 6 sword sect master's strength, then it should be about the same. This. Nietion was stunned after hearing the fat cat's words. His face was dull, and he couldn't understand it all. The fat cat seemed to want him, Jun Shujian, and the 6 sword sect masters to work together and then break the sacred heaven sword seal. But how could they work together like this? Could they make Jun Chujian and the 6 sword sect masters directly pass their own strength of the sword Tao to him? Even if Jun Chujian and the others were willing to do so, Nietion couldn't accept it. Because his current martial physique couldn't withstand so many powerful sword intents at all. He really couldn't understand what the fat cat wanted to do. Is it that hard to understand? The fat cat couldn't help but laugh when he saw the confusion on Nietion's face. Then his body moved and floated in the air. His body released several strands of azure chi that flowed in the air and slowly formed a small sword formation. Nietion looked at the small sword formation and couldn't help but tremble. He saw that there were a total of 8 formation eyes in the sword formation. 1 main formation eye and 7 auxiliary formation eyes. The main formation eye was at the center of the sword formation, while the 7 auxiliary formation eyes formed a circle and surrounded the main formation eye. At this moment, the sword formation suddenly began to move. The 7 auxiliary formation eyes began to release waves of sword intents that finally gathered on the main formation eye. I understand now. Seeing this scene, Nietion's eyes flashed and he shouted in surprise. If he still didn't understand after seeing this, then he would really be a fool. The fat cat's meaning was very simple. It was to use a sword formation to gather the sword intents of Jun Chujian and the others onto Nietion alone. The 7 auxiliary formation eyes were where Jun Chujian and the others were, while the main formation eye was where Nietion was. This meant that Nietion's body contained his own strength of the sword Tao, in addition to the strength of Jun Chujian and the 6 sword sect masters. The 8 people's strength of the sword Tao added together should be similar to the divine heaven ancestor. However, in the next moment, Nietion frowned and asked in surprise, Fat, are you sure I can withstand the sword intents of the Sword Alliance's Alliance Master and the others? Jun Chujian and the 6 sword sect masters were all supreme swordsmen. Any one of their sword intents could suppress Nietion to the point that he couldn't stand up. Chapter 2266. A worried expression appeared on Nietion's face because he felt that the fat cat's method was too risky. Perhaps his life would be at stake. Fat cat chuckled and said, under normal circumstances, your martial physique won't be able to withstand the sword intent of a divine swordsman. However, in the 7 origin sword formation, the formation will help you share most of the pressure and ensure that your martial physique won't be harmed. Really? Nietion's eyes flickered. He still didn't believe it. After all, he was facing 7 divine swordsmen. If any one of them made a mistake, he would lose his life. Don't worry. Fat Cat smiled confidently and said, "My combat strength might be a little weak, but my attainments in the Tao of formations are definitely not to be underestimated. To put it bluntly, even in this forsaken land, it's almost impossible to find a formation master who's more powerful than me." Nietion's face darkened. He looked at Fat Cat speechlessly and thought to himself, "You've never been humble before." Although that was what he said in his heart, Nietion still trusted Fat Cat's attainments in formations very much. So far, Fat Cat had never disappointed him. "Fat, the 7 origin sword formation that you mentioned requires the Sword Alliance Master and the 6 Sect Masters to personally participate. Will they agree?" Nietion suddenly thought of this question and couldn't help but ask. Jun, Chujian, and the 6 Sect Masters were all at the peak of the Sacred Heaven Sword Alliance. Their identities were extraordinary. It wouldn't be easy for Nietion to get these people to help him. Fat Cat smiled proudly and said, "Don't worry. Those Sect Masters and Alliance Masters are more than happy to be the auxiliary formation of the 7 origin sword formation. How could they refuse?" "Why?" Nietion was stunned for a moment and had a puzzled look on his face. "Because once the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal is activated, the sword intent sealed in the seal will be absorbed by the 7 elements sword formation, which will then be absorbed by the swordsman in the formation." Fat Cat chuckled. "Do you think these lords will reject the sword intent in the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal?" I don't think so." Nietion paused for a moment and said with a smile, "The sword intent of the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal was left behind by the Sacred Heaven Ancestor. No swordsman would reject it, especially Jun Chujian. He was counting on these sword intents to save his life." "Very good." Nietion understood everything and was very happy. He said, "Fat, what do we do next?" "The rest is up to me. You just need to rest well and prepare to activate the sword seal. But before that, you have to arrange something for me." Nietion nodded with a smile and said cheerfully, "Go ahead." Following that, Fat Cat talked about a series of things, all about the construction of the 7-element sword formation. It was not an easy task to build the 7-element sword formation. With Fat Cat's current strength, it was impossible to build such a huge sword formation alone. He needed the help of several powerful formation masters. Moreover, the 7-element sword formation also required a variety of spiritual materials. "Little Fatty, within 7 days, can you build the 7 origin sword formation?" Nietion could not help but frown after hearing Little Fatty's request and asked worriedly, "Don't worry. As long as I can gather 9 8th rank formation masters, I can build the 7-element sword formation in 3 days." Fat Cat smiled with confidence. "Yes." Nietion nodded. "I will go find the Alliance Lord and ask him to prepare everything." Of course, Nietion didn't need to worry about everything needed to build the 7-element sword formation. These things should be done by Jun Chujian. A moment later, Nietion came to Jun Chujian's Clear Heart courtyard and told him everything. Jun Chujian didn't doubt Nietion's words and happily agreed to all of Nietion's requests. Next, in just 1 day, Jun Chujian gathered 7 8th rank formation masters and prepared all the spiritual materials Fat Cat needed. Even though we don't have enough formation masters, the good thing is that we have enough spiritual materials to build the 7-element sword formation in 7 days. Fat Cat smiled and showed great confidence. Jun Chujian also discussed with the 6 sect masters, and they were all willing to help. Just as Nietion and Fat Cat expected, who would refuse the divine heaven ancestors' sword intent. Actually, the reason why the 6 sect leaders were willing to help was because Nietion had given them too much of a shock. It was easier for those with strength to gain the trust of others. In the blink of an eye, 6 days passed. When Nietion walked out of the room, he was in high spirits and showed off his ability. In the past few days, he had been cultivating diligently and had completely stabilized his Sword Dao and Martial Dao realm. Compared to a few days ago, his aura had improved. "I wonder how Fat's preparation is going," Nietion murmured and prepared to go to Mount Shengtian to check on the 7-element sword formation. He was fully prepared and only needed to wait for Fat Cat to finish building the 7-element sword formation. Then, he could activate the sacred Heaven Sword seal. Nie Tian was looking forward to this moment. He wondered if he could increase his Sword Dao realm after absorbing the divine Heaven Ancestors' sword intent. Ever since he knew about the 3 supreme realms of the Sword Dao, his desire to increase his Sword Dao realm became even stronger. He believed that as long as he absorbed the sword intent in the sacred Heaven Sword seal, his Sword Dao realm would definitely increase again. As soon as he walked out of the courtyard, Jun Aoqing's figure appeared and greeted Nie Tian with a sweet smile. Nie Tian, are you going to Mount Xingtian? Nie Tian nodded and smiled. Do you want to go too? Of course. Jun Aoqing nodded happily. Today is the day you activate the sacred Heaven Sword seal. The swordsmen of the sacred Heaven Sword sect and the other sects are all here. As the future leader of the sacred Heaven Sword Union, I can't miss such a scene. Nie Tian smiled faintly. Then let's go together. It seemed that Jun Aoqing was full of confidence in her future and already considered herself the future leader of the Sword Union. After all, she was still a little girl and didn't know that the other 6 major sword sects had been coveting the position of the Sword Union's leader for a long time. Then, the two left the sacred Heaven Sword sect and headed for Mount Xingtian. Soon, they appeared outside of Mount Xingtian. Isn't this a bit too much? Before Nie Tian got close to the Divine Heaven Peak, he saw that the sky was already packed with people. As far as the eye could see, there were actually more than 100,000 people. It seems that the swordsmen of the 7 major sword sects are almost all here. He couldn't help but frown and smile bitterly. If I can't activate the sacred Heaven Sword seal today, I'll lose face. He didn't expect the activation of the sacred Heaven Sword seal to be so sensational. All the swordsmen of the 7 major sword sects with a bit of strength were here. The sacred Heaven Sword seal was of vital importance to the sacred Heaven Sword Union. It was almost the symbol of the sacred Heaven Sword Union. The swordsmen of the 7 major sword sects would definitely not miss the opening day of the sacred Heaven Sword seal. Chapter 2267. Nie Tian and Jun Aoqing quickly approached Mount Xingtian. Stay here. However, when they were not far from Mount Xingtian, a deep voice sounded in the air. Boom! Then, a sword shadow whizzed out like a ferocious dragon, heading straight for Nie Tian and Jun Aoqing. Be careful! Nie Tian reacted quickly. With a low roar, Starlight Heaven Slash appeared in his hand, and he slashed out with it. Rumble! Suddenly, a sword shadow whizzed out and collided with the incoming sword shadow. A loud explosion sounded in the air. Although Nie Tian reacted immediately, he was still a little slow, and his aura could not be raised to the maximum. Bang! In the next moment, a wave of sword intent rushed over. Nie Tian and Jun Aoqing's figures were sent flying. The two of them retreated 1,000 meters. The astral soul wings appeared on Nie Tian's back. The wings flapped violently and stabilized his body. Puff! The moment he stabilized his body, Nie Tian's body trembled, and he spat out a mouthful of blood. His face was slightly pale. Nie Tian, are you okay? Jun Aoqing asked nervously when she saw that Nie Tian was injured. Just now, when the sword wave rushed over, in order to prevent Jun Aoqing from getting hurt, Nie Tian stepped forward and used his martial body as a shield to protect Jun Aoqing. If not, he would not have been beaten to the point of vomiting blood. His martial body was strong, so it was not a big deal for him to bear the impact of the sword wave. However, Jun Aoqing's martial body was too weak. If she was hit by the sword wave, she would definitely be seriously injured. I'm fine. Nie Tian wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth and shook his head slightly, indicating that he was fine. He then raised his head and looked at the figure in black in the air. The person who attacked him just now was this black-robed swordsman. The other party looked very young. His appearance was grave and stern, and his eyes were austere. It's you, Ling Hanyang. Jun Aoqing raised her head and recognized the black-robed swordsman. She scolded, Are you crazy? Why did you attack Nie Tian? Ling Hanyang. When Nie Tian heard this name, his eyes trembled. He immediately guessed the identity of this person. He should be the young sect leader of the Lingyun Sword Sect. The sect leader of the Lingyun Sword Sect, Ling Yi, had 3 sons. The second and third sons were Ling Hanxing and Ling Hanfeng respectively. Nie Tian had already met them before. This Ling Hanyang was obviously Ling Ye's eldest son. Boy, you're really strong. No wonder you could defeat my second and third brothers. Ling Hanyang took a step forward. The sword intent around him was rolling and surging. The sword momentum of his whole body was like a mountain surging to the extreme. When Ye Tian sensed Ling Hanyang's energy, he couldn't help but chuckle coldly. It's not that I'm too strong, it's that your two brothers are trash. Ling Hanyang was far stronger than Ling Hanxing and the others. He was a peak paramount god, and was at the peak of the realm of sword and martial arts, just on the verge of breaking through to the legendary level of sword and martial arts. That level of strength would put him very close to being a top expert in the 9 realms. Not even someone as strong as Ghost Marshal Wildsand would be a match for Ling Hanyang. What did you just say, you brat? I dare you to say it again. Ling Hanyang's eyes darkened, and he growled like a wild beast that was about to go berserk. Ling Hanfeng's ears aren't very good. Yang Qi said, "It seems you're the same. Don't tell me this is the power of your Ling clan's bloodline?" Nie Tian sneered and said arrogantly, "I said your 2 younger brothers are trash. Did you hear me? You're looking to die, you little bastard." Ling Hanyang roared. He blurred into motion, causing frost to fill the air around him. Icicles filled the sky. In the next moment, he let out a fierce roar and thrust his sword forward. The space around him shook violently as countless ice spikes appeared and shot towards Nie Tian like countless sharp arrows that filled the sky. Nie Tian could sense the space around him tightening and couldn't help but frown. Immediately, he reacted and pushed June ouching away. Then, with a flap of his wings, he charged straight ahead. At this moment, the people outside the Divine Heaven Peak were attracted over, and they happened to see Nie Tian charging towards the ice spikes that filled the sky. What the fuck? Who's this kid? He's so strong, yet he's fighting with Ling Hanyang. Is he an idiot? Ling Hanyang is one of the top 3 young experts in the Sacred Heaven Sword Alliance. Yet this kid dares to go against his icicles fill the sky. Isn't he courting death? There's probably something wrong with this guy's brain. He's too tired of living. The crowd discussed among themselves, their eyes trembling. Nie Tian. June Ouching was pushed away by Nie Tian, but when she saw the latter charging over, her face turned pale and she screamed. Ling Hanyang saw Nie Tian rushing straight towards him, but his eyes narrowed, and there was a trace of astonishment in them. He didn't expect Nie Tian to not retreat, but charged straight at him. Did this kid see through my martial technique? Ling Hanyang's heart trembled as he exclaimed. His icicles fill the sky required him to accumulate energy in mid-air, so the more he dodged, the more damage he would suffer. Nie Tian didn't retreat at all, and he just happened to dodge the strongest attack of the icicles fill the sky. He saw through the weakness of the icicles fill the sky, which was why he dashed forward. Darkstar Ghost Kill. At this moment, Nie Tian's lips trembled in midair. Forbidden runes surged around his body, and his aura soared to the extreme. At the same time, he released a majestic force of stars from his body, and the starlight heavenly/pierced out. Whoosh! The force of stars was very strange. It condensed into an invisible sword shadow in the air and attacked Ling Hanyang. Ling Hanyang sensed the incoming killing intent, but he couldn't see the sword shadow. His eyes trembled with unconcealable fear. Not good. It was not until the invisible sword shadow was only 100 meters away from him that Ling Hanyang reacted. He screamed and quickly dodged to the side. But it was a pity that he was one step too late. Swoosh! The invisible sword shadow whizzed through the air like a ghost, leaving a trail of blood behind. My arm. The next moment, Ling Hanyang screamed in pain. His entire arm was cut off, and half of his body was soaked in blood. Nie Tian's sword directly cut off one of his arms. The sudden scene made everyone's eyes widen, and they all gasped. Their mouths were wide open, but no sound came out. It had never occurred to them that Ling Hanyang would be injured by Nie Tian, and that he was injured so badly. If Ling Hanyang's reaction had been a little slower, he might have been cut in half by Nie Tian. What was going on? The crowd couldn't understand at all. You only lost an arm? You're lucky. Nie Tian steadied himself, and the corner of his mouth pulled up into a cold smile as he said coldly, "What he used just now was the Dark Star Ghost Kill, a sneak attack in the Starry Sky ancient martial art. The Dark Star Ghost Kill was very fast, and it was very unexpected. Ling Hanyang didn't expect that Nie Tian would directly rush over. So when he was shocked, it was the best time for Nie Tian to use the Dark Star Ghost Kill. And when Ling Hanyang appeared, he directly attacked Nie Tian." Chapter 2268. The scene of Nie Tian cutting off Ling Hanyang's arm caused the crowd to fall into dead silence. Only after a dozen seconds did the crowd snap back to their senses and stare at Nie Tian in shock. Previously, they thought that Nie Tian was courting death, but now they finally understood how terrifying Nie Tian was. He's Nie Tian. The 7 origin sword array was built for him, and he's the one who's going to break the sacred heaven sword seal. At this moment, someone recognized Nie Tian's identity and shouted in surprise. So he's Nie Tian. No wonder he's so terrifying. He's indeed the swordsman that the Alliance Master has taken a fancy to. It seems that there's hope for our sacred heaven sword alliance to open the sacred heaven sword seal. What do you mean by hope? I'm guessing that Lord Nie Tian will definitely be able to open the sacred heaven sword seal. The crowd immediately chimed in, their eyes filled with undisguised fear and awe as they looked at Nie Tian. Facing the change in the crowd's attitude, Nie Tian didn't care at all. After being ridiculed and flattered countless times, he no longer cared about the opinions of unrelated people. It's fine if you flatter me or look down on me. I, Nie Tian, am still Nie Tian, and nothing will change. How is this possible? How can you be so strong? At this moment, Ling Hanyang walked out of the huge shock and looked at Nie Tian in horror. His voice was slightly trembling. Looking down on a person you don't know is your biggest stupidity. Nie Tian sneered, his eyes sweeping over Ling Hanyang with a contemptuous look on his face. In fact, Ling Hanyang was very strong. If it was a head-on confrontation, Nie Tian might not be his opponent. However, he had been too careless. He had thought that he would be able to kill Nie Tian with a flashy move. Who knew that Nie Tian would see through the flaws in his moves and seize the opportunity to deal him a heavy blow? One of Ling Hanyang's arms was chopped off. Although his life wasn't in danger, his battle prowess was greatly reduced because of this. If he wanted to continue fighting with Nie Tian, he would be courting death. Ling Hanyang looked angrily at Nie Tian, extremely unwilling. But at this moment, he really did not have the strength to fight. Jun Aoqing, let's go. Nie Tian didn't want to waste any more time. He came to Jun Aoqing's side and prepared to leave. Jun Aoqing's little face was almost numb from the shock. She finally reacted and looked at Nie Tian with an excited smile. Nie Tian, you're really strong. Nie Tian smiled faintly and did not say anything. Kid, Jun Aoqing is my second brother's woman. How dare you touch her? Suddenly, a cold voice came from the crowd. Then, a burly figure appeared and blocked Nie Tian and Jun Aoqing. Nie Tian frowned and raised his head to look at the person in front of him. This figure was very burly, at least 2.5 meters tall. An ordinary person standing next to him would look like a child. The muscles all over his body bulged like steel, giving off a strong sense of power. This person stood there like an iron tower, emitting a berserk aura. Luo Yilong. Jun Aoqing was stunned. Her beautiful eyes trembled, and she said in shock, "What are you trying to do?" When Nie Tian heard the name Luo Yilong, he immediately understood that the latter must be the young sect leader of the Rakshasa sword sect. His guess was right. Luo Yilong was Roten's eldest son. Luo Yilong, Luo Eru, Luo Sanfeng. It had to be said that Roten was really good at naming his sons. What am I trying to do? Luo Yilong sneered and stared at Nie Tian. He said in a cold voice, "This kid injured 2 of my brothers and is still standing with you. Isn't this a slap to my face?" Luo Yilong, what nonsense are you talking about? Jun Aoqing blushed and rebuked. What does it have to do with you who I'm with? Of course it has something to do with me. Luo Yilong sneered and said in a loud voice, "Everyone in the sacred Heavenly Sword League knows that you, Jun Aoqing, are the woman that my second brother, Luo Eru, likes. Jun Aoqing, you are destined to be a member of the Luo clan for the rest of your life. This kid being with you is a slap to the Luo clan's face." Luo Yilong's voice was like a great bell, exploding in the air like a sudden clap of thunder. Everyone present could hear his words clearly. "Luo Yilong, your bullsh ting." Jun Aoqing's pretty face was so red that she was about to curse. However, Luo Yilong was not angry. Instead, he chuckled and said, "Jun Aoqing, my second brother is infatuated with you. What's wrong with you marrying him? Your sacred Heavenly Sword sect has been declining for a long time. In the future, the Sacred Heavenly Sword League will change its name to the Rakshasa Sword League. As long as you marry my second brother, your Sacred Heavenly Sword sect will still have a place in the Rakshasa Sword League. Isn't that great?" As he finished speaking, Luo Yilong actually started laughing wildly, and he was arrogant to the extreme. When everyone heard Luo Yilong's words, they couldn't help but tense up. No one would have thought that Luo Yilong would dare to say such words in front of so many people. He even directly mentioned the Rakshasa Sword League. Wasn't he clearly trying to rebel? It seemed that Jun Jian had been too lenient toward the 6 major swordsmanship sections. His subordinates could no longer hold back and wanted to replace him as the Sword League's league master. How could Luo Yilong say that the Sacred Heavenly Sword League would change its name to the Rakshasa Sword League? Luo Yilong, you're shameless. After all, Jun Aoqing was just an inexperienced girl. Facing such a situation, she could only scold him with a flushed face. "Jun Aoqing, as long as you can marry my second brother, as your big brother, I don't mind being a little shameless." Luo Yilong chuckled in an extremely domineering manner. Jun Aoqing wanted to say something, but was stopped by Nie Tian. "Jun Aoqing, don't say anything. Just watch quietly from the side." Nie Tian smiled and said to Jun Aoqing, "Leave this idiot to me." When Luo Yilong heard Nie Tian's words, his face sank and he roared, "Brat, who are you calling an idiot?" Nie Tian raised his head and looked at Luo Yilong. "Luo Yilong, I think that not only are you an idiot, but you're also an idiot with a fart mouth. Looks like I was right. The fart mouth is the bloodline power of your Luo clan. It's passed down from father to son, and even brothers have it. Your second and third brothers have a fart mouth, and your father also has a fart mouth. And you just like them. You also have a fart mouth and like to fart." As soon as he said that, the surrounding crowd was stunned for a moment before bursting into laughter. Nie Tian's scolding was so satisfying, so satisfying. The Rakshasa sword sect swordsmen liked to bully others, and the other sword sects all suffered from it. However, most of the sword sects dared not say anything. Who asked the Rakshasa sword sect to be so powerful? Today, Nie Tian's scolding of the Luo clan's father and son made everyone feel comfortable. "Brat, are you courting death?" Luo Yilong's eyes were bloodshot from Nie Tian's scolding. He was like an angry toad, and he looked like he was about to explode. His aura skyrocketed, and a violent sword intent filled the air. Even his tower-like body seemed to have grown a little bigger. How could Luo Yilong tolerate Nie Tian's scolding of him in front of everyone, including the Rakshasa sect leader? Chapter 2269. Enraged, Luo Yilong's aura skyrocketed, making him look like a wild beast. Even his face turned malevolent. Sensing Luo Yilong's terrifying aura, Nie Tian couldn't help but frown. Just like Ling Hanyang, Luo Yilong had the strength of a peak paramount god, at the peak of the unity of sword and martial. However, his martial constitution was clearly stronger than Ling Hanyang's, and it wasn't just by a little. From his physique, it could be seen that he was a strength-based cultivator with an extremely powerful martial constitution. What a powerful aura! The eyes of the crowd trembled as they exclaimed. Luo Yilong was very famous in the Sacred Heaven Sword League, and he was very strong. However, few people had seen his true battle prowess. Today, they could see that he truly lived up to his reputation. Will Nye Tian be a match for Luo Yilong? Everyone's eyes flickered, and they all had the same question in their hearts. Even though they had already seen how terrifying Nye Tian was, Luo Yilong's aura was clearly stronger. Moreover, many people could tell that the reason why Nye Tian could defeat Ling Hanyang was because he had the upper hand. Nye Tian. June Ouching's little face was filled with anxiety, and she subconsciously tugged on Nye Tian's sleeve. However, Nye Tian's expression was very calm. With a faint smile, he waved his hand, signaling for June Ouching to step back. Although June Ouching was worried, she could only step back. Brat, today I, Luo Yilong, will tear you apart with my own hands, Luo Yilong said coldly as he looked at Nye Tian, his eyes flashing with a cold light. Nye Tian's words had thoroughly enraged him. If he couldn't kill Nye Tian with his own hands, he would feel like there was a thorn in his back, and it would be very uncomfortable. If you want to kill me, let's see if you have the ability. Nye Tianling laughed, his eyes cold and calm. Arrogant. Luo Yilong let out a furious roar. His figure flashed, and like a wild beast, he charged straight at him. Outside his body, there was a sword shadow. It was not huge, but the aura it gave off was extremely sharp and ferocious. When Nye Tian saw Luo Yilong rushing over, he couldn't help but narrow his eyes. His opponent's fighting style surprised him. Luo Yilong's speed was very fast. In an instant, he was less than a kilometer away from Nye Tian. Starfire burning sea. Without any hesitation, Nye Tian slashed out with his sword. The sword essence bloomed in the air and turned into a flaming sword shadow, blasting towards Luo Yilong. However, Luo Yilong was extremely brave, and he actually rushed over. Boom! Crack! Just as his figure collided with the flaming sword shadow, a violent sound came from the air, and then the flaming sword shadow collapsed. So strong! The crowd exclaimed in unison when they saw this. Luo Yilong directly smashed Nye Tian's flaming sword shadow, and the strength of his aura was evident. Nye Tian also frowned. He didn't expect Luo Yilong to be so strong. Nye Tian, watch out! June Ouching shouted from afar, and her little face was filled with worry. Brat died. At this moment, Luo Yilong roared like a wild beast and actually punched out. The sword essence condensed into a fish shadow, and it blasted towards Nye Tian. Extreme Young Heavenly Battle Armor, activate. In an instant, Nye Tian reacted. With a low roar, a layer of white light surged around his body and turned into a white light shield. Bang! Crack, crack, crack. Immediately, the sword essence fish shadow landed directly on the white light shield on Nye Tian's body. After a muffled sound, there was a crisp tearing sound. Nye Tian's figure flew out, and while he was still in the air, the battle armor on his body directly collapsed. Whoosh! The wings on his back stabilized, and he immediately steadied himself. However, there was a trace of blood at the corner of Nye Tian's mouth, and his face was slightly pale. He was injured by Ling Hanyang's sneak attack just now, and now he had to face Luo Yilong's punch head-on. He couldn't help but feel strained. It had to be said that Luo Yilong's strength was indeed very strong. The violent aura around him was shocking. Fortunately, Nye Tian's reaction was fast, and he activated the extreme Young Heavenly Battle Armor in time. Otherwise, he would have been seriously injured. The 8th level of the 9 Extremities War God art had a very strong defense, and it blocked most of the force for Nye Tian. Not dead, Luo Yilong looked at Nye Tian, and he was stunned. Clearly, he didn't expect that the latter would survive his punch. Nye Tian's martial body is so strong. The crowd reacted and exclaimed, shocked by the strength of Nye Tian's martial body. Luo Yilong was fierce and domineering, and his aura was terrifying. Nye Tian was hit by his punch at close range, and yet he was only lightly injured. Of course, his martial body was strong. I've said it before. If you want to kill me, it depends on whether you have the ability to do so. Nye Tianling laughed, and his gaze towards Luo Yilong was full of disdain. He could already tell that Luo Yilong was a swordsman different from ordinary people. His sword intent was used in conjunction with his strong martial body, and he relied on his superior martial body to attack his opponent fiercely. Nietion guessed that Luo Yilong was a natural-born martial artist, and it was very likely that he had a spiritual body. "Brat, you're still so stubborn when you're at death's door." Luo Yilong roared furiously. His eyes were filled with killing intent as he howled. "I want to see whether your bones are harder or my fists are harder." As his voice fell, his figure moved, and he dashed towards Nietion. "Good." Nietion's pupils suddenly contracted, and the corners of his mouth curled up into a wild smile. He said coldly, "Since you think your martial body is strong, then I'll use my martial body to defeat you." Rumble. After which, his body trembled as boundless astral energy gushed forth, forming an astral soul armor. At the same time, a sea of crimson lightning appeared behind him, and streaks of thunder dragon chi, like runes, rapidly merged into the armor of the Star Soul. At this moment, Nietion was like a giant made of starlight, standing tall in the sky. Dragon chi. The crowd felt the aura around Nietion, and their eyes trembled violently, and their expressions became incredulous. It had never occurred to them that Nietion could release dragon chi. What was even more strange was that Nietion's dragon chi seemed to be different from ordinary dragon chi, and it had actually merged with another mysterious force. That's right, the dragon chi that Nietion released did not form into a thunder dragon, but merged with the armor of the Star Soul to strengthen his martial body. The armor of the Star Soul was formed by the power of the stars, and the power of the stars was the source of power. It could merge with all kinds of power, including dragon chi. The dragon chi and the power of the stars had merged perfectly, and Nietion felt the power around him exploding. The boundary zone formation of the raw star stone in his body and the 9 dragon veins were running wildly, and he suddenly felt the turbulent power, which made him feel like he was about to explode. Mad Dragon Fist. In the next moment, Luo Yilong's figure appeared, and he punched out. The huge fish shadow was like a falling meteorite, and it attacked in extremely fast speed. At the same time, Nietion did not dodge and also punched out. The fish shadow was like a mountain, and it surged violently. The crowd saw that Nietion did not dodge, but chose to fight head-on with Luo Yilong. They couldn't help but gasp, and their hearts jumped to their throats. Chapter 2270. The crowd's eyes trembled, and their nerves were stretched to the extreme. They didn't want to miss the most exciting moment. Bang! In the next moment, under the attentive gazes of countless people, the 2 fists collided with a loud bang. It was like metal colliding with stone, causing a muffled sound. Boom! Following that, a ripple visible to the naked eye appeared in the void, causing the space to tremble. Following that, a violent force exploded and wreaked havoc in the space. Nietion and Luo Yilong retreated a few hundred meters at the same time and then stabilized themselves at the same time. 2 pairs of cold eyes stared at each other, like fire and water. The crowd was shocked by the scene in front of them. Their eyes widened as if they were wondering if they had seen it wrong. No one expected that the head-on clash between Nietion and Luo Yilong would result in a draw. Nietion's martial physique wasn't weaker than Luo Yilong's at all. But how was that possible? Luo Yilong had a nickname in the Sacred Heavensword Alliance, Mad Dragon, because his martial physique was extremely powerful, just like the legendary Divine Dragon. Nietion's strength was far below Luo Yilong's, but he could actually face him head-on with his martial physique. That was too terrifying. Impossible. At this moment, Luo Yilong suddenly roared, unable to conceal the shock in his eyes. He originally thought that Nietion was courting death by clashing head-on with him. But who would have thought that Nietion's martial physique would be so powerful? Luo Yilong, I admit that your martial physique is very powerful, but mine isn't weak either. Nietion laughed and said arrogantly. At the same time, the star energy and dragon chi in his body surged out crazily, causing the star soul armor on his body to look even more dazzling. In fact, Nietion wasn't sure about the effect of the fusion of dragon chi and star energy. He originally thought that he would be at a disadvantage in a head-on clash with Luo Yilong. But now, it seemed that the power of the fusion of the dragon chi and the power of the stars was beyond his expectations. Damn it! Luo Yilong roared in anger. He moved and punched out with both his fists towards Nietion. The thing he was most proud of was his powerful martial body. However, in front of Nietion, he had lost the capital to be arrogant. This made him feel humiliated. Nietion was not afraid and stood up to resist. The two figures clashed head-on in midair. One of them punched and the other kicked, neither giving way at all. Bang! 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 Muffled sounds of explosions could be heard in the void. Violent forces stirred the space, and it seemed as if even the heavens and the earth were shaking. Wow! People in the crowd were shocked by the scene in the sky. They stared at the two of them with blank eyes, and the shock was written all over their faces. Such a battle was too terrifying. It was a battle of martial bodies and strength. It all depended on whose martial body was stronger. It was hard to imagine that this was a battle between two supreme gods. If it wasn't for the overwhelming aura around Nietion and Luo Yilong, people would have thought that it was a battle between two low-level martial artists. Jun Aoqing was also stunned. Her small face was stiff, and her mouth was wide open. She couldn't say anything for a long time. She didn't expect that Nietion's martial body was so powerful that he could fight against Luo Yilong. In the Sacred Heaven Sword League, Luo Yilong was simply a monster. Unexpectedly, Nietion was even more monstrous than a monster. People saw Nietion and Luo Yilong moving in the air. Wherever the two figures went, the void started to tremble, and the terrifying power continued to wreak havoc. In just a moment, Nietion and Luo Yilong had exchanged more than 100 punches. Bang! At this moment, a muffled sound was heard, and the two figures separated. Who? Luo Yilong stabilized his body and panted heavily. He stared at Nietion with a horrified expression and a trace of fear. He didn't expect that Nietion not only had a strong martial body, but also a terrifying force in his body. He originally thought that after a few dozen punches, he would be able to beat Nietion until he couldn't fight back. But the reality was that Nietion was getting stronger and stronger, while he was getting weaker and weaker. There seemed to be endless energy in Nietion's body, and how could it be so terrifying? Luo Yilong couldn't figure out what kind of martial body Nietion had. How could it be so terrifying? That's it. Nietion looked at Luo Yilong and sneered with disdain in his eyes. The reason he was fighting with Luo Yilong was partly to test his martial body, and partly to wear down Luo Yilong. Although Luo Yilong was as strong as a wild beast, that didn't necessarily mean he could last long. Nietion was different. He had awakened the power of 800 billion stars, the Paragon Dragon bloodline, and the Earth String essence. Even if he fought for a day and a night like this, he would not be tired. Although he was already a paramount god, he had only awakened the power of 800 billion stars in his primal star stone. It seemed that he would need to reach a higher level before he could awaken the power of the last 100 billion stars. But for now, 800 billion stars were more than enough. Luo Yilong took a deep breath and glared viciously at Nietion. Why are you so strong, you brat? Tianling chuckled. Why does a loser like you need to know so much? Bullshit. I haven't lost yet. Being mocked, Luo Yilong was instantly enraged. Sword intent surged out from his body and formed a 1,000-meter-long sword shadow around him. Finally going to use your trump card? Seeing this, the corner of Nietion's mouth curled up into a cold smile, and he said directly, "Come on, let me see how strong you are." Luo Yilong had been fighting with his fists, and although it was simple, it was extremely vicious. He was completely enraged and was ready to use his most powerful move, Mad Dragon Fury Sword. Die, you little piece of trash. Luo Yilong roared like a wild beast, his eyes flashing with killing intent as he shot toward Nietion like a bolt of lightning. So powerful, the crowd couldn't help but exclaim when they sensed the sharp energy in the air. Facing Luo Yilong's powerful attack, Nietion let out a furious roar without hesitation. Sword sealing forbidden formation. Sword dragon devours the world. Following this, his blood chi and sword will burst out from his body, which merge with the astral force and dragon chi surrounding him. The sword sealing forbidden formation was formed in the space around him. The power of the formation instantly transformed into a mad dragon in the shape of a giant sword, which rolled in the air. The ferocious aura instantly tightened the space around him, as if it was about to tear the space apart. "This guy is stronger," the crowd yelled out in astonishment as they sensed the invisible force in the air. They did not expect that while Luo Yilong was strong, Nietion was even stronger. The sword dragon unleashed by Nietion had the power to shake the heavens and earth, as if the heavens and earth had become smaller. Boom! The next moment, under the watchful eyes of the crowd, the two extreme forces collided with each other, causing the space to tremble. Suddenly, an endless force spread out in all directions. The confrontation between the two forces only lasted for a moment. Bang! Crack, crack, crack! After a muffled sound, the sword shadows around Luo Yilong were torn into pieces by the horrifying sword dragons. Chapter 2271. Boom! A violent aura rolled over, vast and mighty. No! In the blink of an eye, Luo Yilong felt the aura of death approaching. He was so frightened that his face turned deathly pale, and he cried out in panic. The sword dragon in the sky was too powerful. Once it landed on Luo Yilong's body, there would only be one ending for him: death. At this critical moment, something unexpected happened. A figure appeared in the sky and struck out with his palm. The shadow of the palm was like a mountain, and it shattered the sword dragon in the sky. What? The crowd gasped in astonishment when they saw the man who had just appeared, and their expressions changed in an instant. The figure was no stranger to them. It was the leader of the Rakshasa sword sect, Roten. "You're finally here." The corners of Nietion's mouth curled up slightly when he saw Luo Tong. He wasn't surprised at all. "Father." Luo Yilong suddenly reacted and cried out in alarm. His face was still in a state of shock. It had to be said that Roten's attack was very timely. If he had been a little slower, Luo Yilong would have died. "Bastard." Roten suddenly turned around and glared at Luo Yilong. He shouted angrily, "Do you know who Mr. Nietion is? Who gave you the courage to attack him?" Luo Yilong was stunned. He was confused and froze on the spot. When the crowd saw this, they couldn't help but be stunned. All of them had a dumbfounded expression. They thought that Roten would attack Nietion after he showed up. To their surprise, Roten scolded Luo Yilong. "Humph." Nietion looked at Roten and laughed cold. He had a strange look in his eyes. "Mr. Nietion, my son is ignorant and offended you. Please forgive him." Roten heard Nietion's laughter and turned around. He bowed to him and said respectfully. The crowd was stunned again. They looked as if they had seen a ghost. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. The leader of the Rakshasa sect was so respectful in front of Nietion. What was going on? "Faction leader Luo, stop acting in front of me." Nietion sneered at the respectful Roten and said, "Do you really think I'm a 3-year-old kid? Why do you say that, Mr. Nietion?" Luo Tong went blank for a moment, and then asked with a puzzled expression, "Why do you say that?" "Faction leader Luo, if you continue to pretend, you're underestimating me." With a faint smile, Nietion said, "Without your permission, Luo Yilong wouldn't have dared to make a move against me." This. Roten's eyes darkened, and he was speechless. He didn't expect Nietion to be so smart as to figure out what was going on. That's right. Luo Yilong attacked Nietion because Roten allowed it. Roten had already acknowledged Nietion's strength and agreed to let Nietion activate the sacred heaven sword seal. He even agreed to help. However, he had secretly asked Luo Yilong to attack Nietion. This method could be said to be vicious and vicious. On the one hand, he wanted to avenge his two sons, and on the other hand, he wanted to test Nietion's strength. If Nietion died in the hands of Luo Yilong, he would have succeeded in his revenge. At the same time, It would prove that Nye Tion's talent wasn't as strong as everyone thought. If Luo Yilong didn't defeat Nye Tian, it would prove that Nye Tian was indeed very strong. Then he could say that Luo Yilong was looking for Nye Tian and it had nothing to do with him. However, he didn't expect that Luo Yilong would almost die in the hands of Nye Tian. This forced him to show up. What shocked him even more was that Nye Tian had seen through everything with a single glance. Nye Tian's intelligence was far beyond his expectations. Just when Roten was feeling a little awkward, Nye Tian smiled again and said loudly, "Faction leader Ling, isn't it time for you to come out?" Hearing his voice, the crowd was stunned. They looked around, but didn't see anyone. Ling Yi, Roten's eyes trembled, and he immediately reacted. He looked at the void and roared, "Ling Yi, little friend Nye Tian, you're indeed smart. Nothing can be hidden from you." In the next moment, a voice sounded in the void. Then, a figure walked out. It was the Ling Yun sect leader, Ling Yi. "You're here indeed." Nye Tian looked at Ling Yi and chuckled in his heart. In fact, he didn't even notice Ling Yi's existence. He just casually mentioned it and didn't expect it to be true. He guessed that since Ling Hanyang appeared, Ling Yi should be nearby as well, just that he didn't show himself. Ling Hanyang and Luo Yilong attacked Nye Tian one after another. Without Ling Yi and Roten's permission, they wouldn't have dared to do so. After all, Nye Tian was about to activate the Sacred Heaven Sword seal. For the entire Sacred Heaven Sword Union, he was an important person. No matter how arrogant Ling Hanyang and Luo Yilong were, they wouldn't dare to casually attack Nye Tian, unless Ling Yi and Roten, who were behind them, asked them to do so. "Brother Luo, it seems like our probing was unnecessary." After Ling Yi appeared, he looked at Luo Tong and said with a faint smile, "Mr. Nye Tian is indeed very strong. We were overthinking it. Our probing this time was indeed unnecessary." Roten was naturally smart and followed Ling Yi's words. Looking at the two of them, Nye Tian smiled and didn't expose them. Instead, he said, "Sect Masters, I'll treat what you did just now as your probing. However, I hope that you won't play any tricks when activating the Sacred Heaven Sword seal. I'm sure you know better than me what the Sacred Heaven Sword seal means to the Sacred Heaven Sword Union. If anything goes wrong when activating the Sacred Heaven Sword seal, you won't be able to bear the consequences." Roten and Ling Yi looked at each other and nodded. "Mr. Nye Tian, don't worry. We'll do our best to cooperate." Even though Nye Tian's tone was that of a superior, they still had to accept it. As smart as Nye Tian was, how could he not see through Luo Tong and Ling Yi's thoughts? The so-called probing was actually two murderous moves. If it wasn't for Nye Tian's strength, he would have been dead by now. Perhaps Roten and Ling Yi's actions were indeed probing, but they hoped to see Nye Tian die. It was a pity that Nye Tian's strength exceeded their expectations once again. Two sect masters. Nye Tian fixed Luo Tong and Ling Yi with a grim look in his eyes and said, "You've already made a mistake. Don't make the same mistake again. Remember, if you take a wrong step, what awaits you will be eternal damnation." Roten and Ling Yi were stunned for a moment. Feeling the coldness in Nye Tian's eyes, their hearts couldn't help but tremble. Nye Tian's words were simply a threat. He was threatening the two strongest sect masters of the 7 major swordsmanship sects in front of so many people. Nye Tian's courage was simply abnormal. Roten's eyes trembled, clearly suppressing his anger. He could tolerate Nye Tian's arrogance, but he couldn't tolerate the latter directly threatening him. Chapter 2272. Luo Tong took a step forward, looked Nye Tian in the eyes, and said coldly, "Nye Tian, what happened just now was indeed our fault, but you still need our help to activate the Sacred Heaven Sword seal. Aren't you afraid that we'll refuse to help if you talk to us like this?" Nye Tian felt Roten's anger, but he only smiled. "Sect Master Luo, do you think that you're very important to activate the Sacred Heaven Sword seal? I'll tell you now that the most important thing for the Sacred Heaven Sword seal is the 7 origin sword array. I'm asking you to help because I'm giving you a chance to absorb the sword intent in the Sacred Heaven Sword seal. If you're not willing to help, you can F***CK off at any time. I'll find someone else." His voice was calm, but it was filled with extreme arrogance. Nie Tian didn't care about Roten's feelings at all, and his attitude was even more forceful than before. Nie Tian, you. Roten's eyes narrowed, and his face was so gloomy that it was almost dripping blood. He felt like there was a lump of stuffy air stuck in his throat that he couldn't spit out. It was extremely uncomfortable. He originally thought that if he refused to help, Nie Tian's attitude would soften a little. But the reality was that his words directly angered Nie Tian. The latter became even more forceful and even asked him to F***CK off. This was in front of 100,000 swordsmen of the Sacred Heavensword Alliance. As a sect master, how could he put his face? Mr. Nie Tian, why are you so angry? We're all on the same side, so let's talk things out. At this moment, Ling Yi saw that the situation was in a stalemate, so he quickly smiled apologetically. Of course, he was so humble not because of Nie Tian, but because of the Sacred Heavensword seal. At this moment, he was very sure that Nie Tian could really break the Sacred Heavensword seal. Thus, he wasn't willing to give up this opportunity to absorb the sword intent. As long as he could absorb the sword intent in the Sacred Heavensword seal, it was nothing for Ling Yi to lose face and lower his stance. I also want to speak nicely. Unfortunately, some people don't know how to appreciate kindness. I gave them face, but they don't want it. They just have to stick their faces out for me to slap. Nie Tian's lips curled into a cold smile as he spoke in an extremely arrogant manner. You little bastard, you. Hearing Nie Tian's words, Roten growled. His face turned red, and he was so angry that he almost spat blood. Brother Roten, calm down. You must calm down. Ling Yi took a step forward and signaled Roten not to act rashly. What? Sect leader Luo, are you going to fight me personally? Nie Tianling laughed as he looked at Roten with a provocative gaze. Roten was so angry that his intestines were about to explode. He gritted his teeth, but did not dare to make a move. He knew the importance of Nie Tian, especially after the latter defeated Ling Hanyang and Luo Yilong. The people of the Sacred Heavensword Alliance had personally witnessed Nie Tian's powerful talent, and they were even more certain that the latter could break the Sacred Heavensword seal. If they killed Nie Tian in this situation, it would be equivalent to offending everyone. Although the Rakshasa Sword sect was powerful, they didn't dare to openly go against the other 6 sections, especially since there was still Jun Chuyin, who had the strength to kill Roten in an instant. The crowd looked at the scene before them with trembling eyes and shocked hearts. Now, their attitude towards Nie Tian was even more respectful and fearful. Not only was Nie Tian powerful and talented, but his temperament was also incomparable to that of an ordinary person. He embarrassed Roten and Ling Yi in front of so many people. This courage alone was enough to make people kneel in admiration. What's going on here? At this moment, a deep voice rang out from the void. Then a white-robed figure descended from the sky like a mountain, landing in front of the crowd. Lord Alliance Lord. When the crowd saw the person's face, their hearts trembled and their eyes were filled with shock. The person who came was none other than the Sacred Heavensword Alliance's Lord, Jun Chujian. Then, another 4 figures appeared. They were the sect masters of the other 4 sections. Lord Alliance Lord. Roten and Ling Yi bowed and greeted Jun Chujian when they saw him. In front of everyone, they had to maintain this level of respect. Roten, Ling Yi, didn't I tell you to wait in the Sacred Heaven Hall? Why did you come here in advance? Jun Chujian stared at Roten and Ling Yi and said coldly. Luo Tong and Ling Yi had awkward expressions on their faces and were momentarily speechless. Everyone saw what happened just now. If Jun Chujian knew the truth, he definitely wouldn't let them off so easily. Even if it was just for show, he would still give them a heavy punishment. At this moment, neither Roten nor Ling Yi had the courage to openly fall out with Jun Chujian. Lord Alliance Lord, I was the one who asked the 2 sect masters to come. At this moment, Nie Tian's voice suddenly sounded. He looked at Roten and Ling Yi with a faint smile. You asked them to come? Jun Chujian frowned, obviously not believing it. He asked, why are you looking for them? Roten and Ling Yi were also stunned and looked at Nie Tian in confusion. They clearly didn't expect Nie Tian to stand out at this moment. Nie Tian smiled faintly and said, "Didn't I have some minor conflicts with the two sect masters? I was thinking that we should work together to activate the sacred Heaven Sword seal. That's why I've invited the two sect masters here, hoping to reconcile with them and let go of the grudge with a smile." Speaking till here, Nie Tian's lips curled up as he looked at Luo Ling and the other person and said loudly, "Two sect heads, is it like this?" "Yes, yes, yes, yes." Roten and Ling Yi were not fools. They instantly understood and nodded their heads like a rattle drum. Jun Chujian narrowed his eyes and asked, "Have you reconciled?" Nie Tian nodded with a smile. "Of course I have no problem with that. It just depends on whether the two sect masters are willing to reconcile." I'm willing. Just as Nie Tian finished speaking, Ling Yi responded loudly with a very kind attitude. "Sect Master Ling is indeed a generous man." Nie Tian smiled. Then he turned to Luo Tong and asked, "What about you, Sect Master Luo?" "I am willing." Roten's eyes were as gloomy as water. The anger on his face had yet to completely disappear as he squeezed out a few words through gritted teeth. "Sovereign Luo, you don't look too good. Don't tell me that you're willing, but actually want to kill me in your heart." Nie Tian smiled and said half-jokingly, "Nie Tian, I, Sovereign Roten, am willing to reconcile with you." Roten's face was pale from anger, but he still had to show his proper demeanor in front of Jun Chujian and the other sect masters. He squeezed out a smile and said loudly, "That's right." Nie Tian smiled proudly, but then his face darkened and he said coldly, "Sovereign Luo, you've made the right move. I hope that you won't make the wrong move next." Roten's eyes trembled and his face turned even paler when he heard Nie Tian's words. Of course, he understood what Nie Tian meant. The latter was still threatening him, and he could only accept the threat. Roten felt an indescribable discomfort all over his body, as if he was being bitten by thousands of ants. It almost drove him crazy. At this moment, he finally understood how terrifying Nie Tian was. With just a few words, he had directly crushed his mentality. Chapter 2273. Roten had completely witnessed how terrifying Nie Tian was, and the way he looked at the latter carried a trace of unconcealable fear. Very well. I'm deeply gratified that the two sect leaders are able to reconcile with Nie Tian. Jun Chujian saw the change in Roten's expression and said loudly with a faint smile. He was very shocked at this moment, as he did not expect Nie Tian to be able to settle both Roten and Ling Yi. He had been dealing with Luo Ling and Ling Yi for more than 100,000 years, and he knew that both of them were very troublesome fellows. Even he only maintained a relatively equal relationship with both of them, whereas Nie Tian was standing in front of Roten and Ling Yi with a high attitude, and both of them actually accepted it. Nie Tian, it seems that I still underestimated you. No wonder that fellow held you in such high esteem. Jun Chujian glanced at Nie Tian and said in his heart. At this moment, he had a feeling that letting Jun Ouching save Nie Tian was the wisest decision he had made in his life. Lord Alliance Leader, fellow sect leaders, since we are all here, let's head over now. Nie Tian smiled faintly and glanced at Jun Chujian and the 6 sect leaders. Jun Chujian nodded his head slightly and immediately led everyone to Mount Xingtian. Jun Ouching followed behind Nie Tian, and her little face was still filled with shock. After what had happened just now, Nie Tian had become a godlike existence in her heart. She had seen with her own eyes that Roten and Ling Yi lowered their heads in front of Nie Tian, and this was something that even Jun Chujian could not do. After a while, Nie Tian and the rest arrived at the sky above Mount Xingtian. Nie Tian. Fat Cat saw Nie Tian from afar and shouted excitedly. Nie Tian smiled faintly. His silhouette moved, and he came to Fat Cat's side. He asked, "Fat, how's the construction of the 7-element sword array?" "It's done." The Fat Cat smiled proudly and said, "I have tried countless times. With my character, I guarantee that the 7-element sword formation will work normally." And Machem. Nie Tian nodded his head heavily, after which His gaze landed on a huge array before him. He could clearly feel that the entire formation was releasing an extremely majestic aura of a formation. Outside the sword formation, the 7 divine array masters were smiling with shock in their eyes. Even they themselves did not expect to be able to build such a huge sword formation. Master Chinchilla, what is this sword formation used for? Just then, a divine array master walked over and asked carefully, as if he was afraid that the fat cat would be angry. Your formation skills are not good enough. Even if I explain it to you, you won't understand. It's better that you don't ask. Fat cat did not hold back and said arrogantly, Yes. Master Chinchilla is right. The divine array master nodded and smiled apologetically. The other divine array masters also walked over and looked at the fat cat with respect. Jun Shujian and the 6 patriarchs walked over and saw the scene in front of them. They were confused. They knew that these divine array masters were very arrogant people. Even in front of Jun Shujian and the others, they were not this respectful. But now, these 7 divine array masters were looking at the fat cat with admiration. This was too strange. Little did they know that after following Fat Cat to build the 7 elemental sword formation, the 7 divine array masters were very impressed by the latter's formation skills. They even fantasized that they could become Fat Cat's disciples. Unfortunately, the Fat Cat had no intention of taking them as disciples. Old man, the 7 elemental sword formation is ready. At this moment, the Fat Cat looked at Jun Shujian and said casually, Now, I will transmit a diagram of the sword formation into your divine consciousness. After you enter the formation, follow my sword formation diagram and use your sword intent to activate the formation. Do you understand? Jun Shujian frowned. No one had ever called him old man. The Fat Cat was the first, but after thinking for a while, he nodded obediently. Seeing that Jun Shujian had nodded, the other 6 patriarchs nodded as well. Next, the Fat Cat transmitted the diagram of the sword formation to Jun Shujian and the others. At the same time, he gave Nietian a completely different working diagram of the sword formation. All right, we can start now. Everyone, enter the formation. After doing all this, little Fat Cat laughed lightly. With a flash, it disappeared into the dimension of a Yuan fetus. Nietian smiled and looked at Jun Shujian. Lord, let's enter the formation. Jun Shujian nodded and glanced at the 6 patriarchs. Everyone, I won't emphasize the importance of the sacred Heaven Sword seal. This time, we will work together with Nietian to activate the sacred Heaven Sword seal. I hope that everyone will work together and not have any other thoughts. If anyone dares to play tricks, I will be the first to kill him. Sensing the murderous intent in Jun Shujian's eyes, the 6 patriarchs nodded. Seeing this, Nietian couldn't help but smile. Lord, it seems like your threats are much better than mine. The sacred Heaven Sword seal had a special meaning to Jun Shujian, so he naturally attached great importance to it. Next, under countless gazes, Nietian and the others entered the 7 origin sword formation. Jun Shujian and the others landed on the 7 auxiliary formation eyes of the 7 origin sword formation. Meanwhile, Nietian landed on the main formation eye of the sword formation. The moment he landed, Nietian felt an extremely powerful aura of the formation circulating in the void. The aura of the formation merged with the heavens and earth and surged in the space. Fat's attainments and formations are indeed powerful. Sensing the powerful aura of the formation, Nietian couldn't help but exclaim in his heart. The expressions of Jun Shujian and the others were also extremely shocked. At this moment, they finally realized how terrifying Fat Cat was. No wonder those divine formation masters were so respectful to Fat. Even though they weren't divine formation masters, they could feel the powerful formation intent in the space. Everyone, let's begin. Nietian took a deep breath and swept his gaze across Jun Shujian and the others. The 7 of them responded at the same time and then began to release the sword intent in their bodies according to the sword formation diagram in their divine senses. The 7 of them were all supreme, god-level swordsmen, so one could imagine how powerful their sword intent was. The moment they released the sword intent in their bodies, 7 powerful sword intents whizzed out like raging dragons and crashed into the sword formation. Boom! The entire sword formation was struck by the sword intent and instantly started to circulate. The boundless power of the formation surged out like a raging wave, causing the surrounding heavens and earth to shake as if it was about to collapse. Boom! In the next moment, under the stimulation of the sword formation, the 7 streaks of sword intent suddenly expanded. Like ancient beasts, they rumbled and roared as they charged towards Nyetion. Gasp! The crowd gasped when they saw this. Their expressions froze. If 7 powerful sword intents were to crash into Nyetion's back at the same time, wouldn't he die a horrible death on the spot? Boom! Then, under the astonished gazes of the crowd, the 7 sword intents landed on him. At the same time, a protective shield formed by the formation appeared around Nyetion's body. The barrier seemed to be very weak, but it was very strange. It was able to withstand the 7 enormous sword intents. Chapter 2274. How terrifying! The crowd was shocked by the scene in the sword formation, and they all cried out in alarm. None of them could ever have guessed that the 7 origin sword formation would be so powerful that it could actually help Nyetion withstand the sword will of 7 transcendental sword masters. The sword will of 7 transcendental sword masters was a force to be reckoned with. Even entire mountain range would be destroyed in the blink of an eye. Nyetion was only an early paramount god, and the only reason he could withstand such power was because of the 7 origins sword formation. The 7 origins sword array was personally supervised by Master Totoro. It consumed hundreds of thousands of spiritual materials. The power contained in it is not something you laymen can imagine. One of the divine array masters looked at everyone's shocked expression and smiled proudly. That's right, another formation master said proudly. With the help of 7 8-step formation masters and Grandmaster Chinchilla's guidance, it's only natural that this sword formation would be very powerful. The other divine array masters nodded in agreement, unconsciously revealing admiration in their eyes. The reverence they had for Little Fat Cat was something only they themselves knew, outsiders would never know of. Meanwhile, in the middle of the 7 origins sword formation, Jun Shujian and the others had been worried that Nyetion wouldn't be able to withstand the power of the sword will. But now that they saw the power of the 7 origin sword formation, they felt much more at ease. Nyetion was in the eye of the formation, and all of the sword will was converging on him. Even with the sword formation protecting him from the sword will, he could still sense the terrifying pressure. In the blink of an eye, the sword formation had absorbed all of the terrifying sword will. That kind of violent sword intent that was about to burst out made him feel a strong pressure. Beads of sweat were popping up on his forehead, but his mouth was twisted into a smile. As the pressure of the sword intent continued to rise, Nyetion could feel the sword intent within his body growing stronger and stronger. That rapid advancement process allowed him to clearly feel the changes in his power. To any swordsman, it was a very precious experience. Although Nyetion's own strength had not reached this level, he had experienced this degree of power. Could there be a better feeling than being able to feel an obvious increase in strength? Nyetion, focus and use the power of the stars to purify these sword wills and merge them with your own sword wills. At this moment, the fat cat's voice rang out, tinged with nervousness and excitement. Nyetion was at the main eye of the array, receiving the sword intent of the 7 supreme divine swordsmen at the same time. These were 7 completely different sword intents. He had to accept these 7 sword intents and fuse them with his own. Fortunately, he had the raw star stone in his body. Otherwise, such a vast and complicated sword intent would definitely have crushed his own sword intent. Nyetion crazily released the power of the stars, accepted the 7 sword intents, and merged them with his own sword intent. A moment later, he felt the sword will in his body skyrocket to the extreme, and his body felt like it was about to explode. In fact, the pressure he was under at the moment was only a small part of all the sword will. Most of the pressure was borne by the sword array. However, even if it was just a small portion of the sword intent, it was still extremely oppressive to him. Okay, now try to break through the sword seal. Fat Cat felt that Nietion was almost at his limit and hurriedly said, Okay. Nietion nodded heavily. Then his eyes trembled as he stared at the sacred heaven sword seal on Mount Xingyan. In the next moment, he took a deep breath, and the fiend god force and sword will in his body surged out at the same time, merging together to form the fiend god sword will. The moment the fiend god sword will appeared, a sword momentum was released from Nietion's body. It was so majestic that it actually caused the 7 elements sword array to shake. Go! Then, he roared, and the sword will suddenly burst out. Under the stimulation of the power of the array in the space, it turned into a huge sword shadow and whizzed out, rushing towards the sacred heaven sword seal. What a powerful sword will! In an instant, the crowd felt the terrifying pressure of the sword will. Their eyes trembled violently, and they all cried out in surprise. They were all swordsmen, and their perception of sword will was far more sensitive than that of ordinary cultivators. The sword intent contained in Nietion's sword strike was simply freakish. The boundless pressure of the sword will filled the void, and it seemed that the world had become small. The crowd had never seen such a terrifying sword will before, and the shock in their hearts was all revealed on their faces. They could not imagine that Nietion was able to release such a terrifying sword. What they did not know was that although this sword was released by Nietion, it was not his own strength. This sword was the result of Nietion's fusion of the sword will of Jun Chujian and the other supreme legendary swordsman, as well as his own sword will, and the power of the array in the 7-element sword array, which was why it could reach such a terrifying level. This was the only way that he could resonate with the sword will in the sacred heaven sword seal. The crowd's eyes trembled as they looked at the huge sword will in the void. Their expressions were about to turn into stone. This scene was too shocking. It was something that they had never expected. Boom! In the void, the huge sword shadow was like a roaring dragon, rolling out. Even the void let out a groan. In the next moment, the mountain-like sword shadow descended and directly bombarded the sacred heaven sword seal. Nietion's eyes suddenly narrowed, and they became extremely hot. However, the scene that happened next made everyone's jaws drop. The terrifying sword shadow fell and was absorbed by the sacred heaven sword seal like a clay ox entering the sea. The void immediately fell into silence, as if nothing had happened. The strange scene stunned everyone. They were all petrified, and their eyes were filled with horror. They had no idea what had happened. How is this possible? Nietion was stunned for a few seconds before he finally reacted. He could not believe the scene in front of him. It was too strange that nothing happened when such a huge sword strike collided with the sacred heaven sword seal. How terrifying was the sacred heaven sword seal? It actually directly swallowed and absorbed that sword shadow. Not only Nietion, but Jun Chujian and the others were also completely stunned and could not make a sound for a long time. The scene in front of them was beyond their understanding of martial arts. They could not understand it at all. The scene fell into a dead silence. Everyone held their breaths and did not know how to express the shock in their hearts. What's going on? At this moment, even Fat Cat was surprised. She did not know what had happened. Try again. Nietion frowned, and his eyes became determined. He roared in his heart. He felt that the sword will just now was not strong enough, so he wanted to try again. Boom! However, at this moment, the sacred heaven sword seal trembled strangely, as if a sleeping beast was about to wake up. Nietion's eyes narrowed, and his heart tensed up. Hum! In the next moment, a sword hum was heard. It had the power to pierce through the clouds and crack rocks. It resounded in the void like the cry of a crane, causing everyone's heart to tremble. Chapter 2275. Sword Intent Resonance. It's definitely sword intent resonance. Nietion heard the clear sound of the sword, and he was extremely shocked. He was very sure that the sound of the sword was a sign of sword intent resonance. It's really sword intent resonance. The sacred heaven sword seal is about to be activated. Almost at the same time, Fat Cat's surprised and excited voice was heard. They didn't expect that the sword shadow, just now, could really trigger the sword intent resonance of the sacred heaven sword seal. They originally thought that the sword shadow was swallowed by the sacred heaven sword seal. At this moment, the crowd was also stunned. They heard the sound of the sword, but didn't know what would happen next. Jun Chujian and the others were also stunned. They also knew that the sacred heaven sword seal was about to be activated. Hum, whem. A clear and intense sword howl resounded out ceaselessly and surged in the heavens and the earth. In the surrounding space, sword waves visible to the naked eye spread in all directions like huge ripples. The crowd was hit by the sword waves and involuntarily retreated. It seemed that the sacred heaven sword seal was releasing a warning signal for the crowd to retreat quickly. The crowd didn't know what was going on, but they had a faint premonition that something bad would happen next. The crowd quickly retreated, and most of them retreated to a place 100,000 meters away from Mount Xingtian. On Mount Xingtian, the sacred heaven sword seal shook violently, and the sound of the sword was endless. Fat, what's going on? And yet Tian frowned, unable to hide the worry on his face. He felt that the sacred heaven sword seal seemed to be showing signs of losing control, like an agitated beast that could go berserk at any time. I don't know either. The little fat cat's expression was very unsightly, and its voice trembled as it answered Nietian. Boom, boom, boom. Then, waves of sword waves surged even more violently. Heaven and earth were shaking. The surrounding mountains of the sacred sky peak were impacted by the sword waves and were on the verge of collapse, as if they were going to collapse in the next moment. Jun Chujian and the others were trembling. They obviously didn't expect this to happen. Nietian. Jun Chujian couldn't bear it anymore and shouted loudly. He was eager to try and leave his seat. Old man, don't move. At this time, without waiting for Nietian to speak, little fat cat's figure directly appeared and shouted at Jun Chujian. All of you, listen up. No matter what happens next, you must hold your positions and don't move. When Jun Chujian saw the little fat cat's expression, he couldn't help but be stunned for a moment. He immediately steadied himself and didn't dare to move anymore. The sword intent in the sacred heaven sword seal is too strong. Fat Cat's eyes darkened and he shouted. When the sword seal is activated, only the 7 elements sword formation can withstand the sword intent. If there's a problem with the sword formation, all of you will be killed by the sword intent. Do you understand? Jun Chujian's eyes trembled. He didn't expect the consequences to be so serious, and he quickly nodded. Fat Cat moved and returned to the origin fetus space. The activation of the sacred heaven sword seal was very different from what he had expected. He didn't know what would happen next. Jun Chujian and the others held their positions and didn't dare to slack off. The sword cry in their ears grew more and more violent, as if a primordial wild beast was slowly losing control. The crowd was shocked when they heard the sword hum the air and couldn't help but step back. At this moment, an even more terrifying sword hum was heard. The cry of a crane pierced through the 9 heavens, earth-shattering. Boom! Then, an extremely powerful sword wave appeared. It was like the surging waves of a tsunami, and it surged in all directions. The terrifying sword wave instantly spread out for hundreds of thousands of meters. Everyone was hit by the sword wave and was forced to step back again. Some of the weaker swordsmen even vomited blood on the spot. At the same time, Nietian looked at the sacred heaven sword seal and felt a violent power surging inside, like a terrifying beast that was about to break out of its cage and wreak havoc in the world. The sacred heaven sword seal is about to be activated. Fat Cat's voice was heard with a hint of fear and excitement. Boom! As soon as he finished speaking, the sacred heavenly sword seal suddenly trembled and an explosion could be heard, as if thousands of heavens were struck by lightning. Then an extreme sword intent broke out of the seal. The violent sword aura was like the emperor dragon, rolling and roaring between heaven and earth. Boom, boom, boom. In the next instant, the supreme sword will actually expanded in the space, then condensed into a boundless sword shadow, towering between the heavens and the earth. Everyone gasped when they saw the enormous sword shadow. Their expressions became dull. The enormous sword shadow was like a giant standing between heaven and earth. The body of the sword was like a towering cliff, and the tip of the sword reached into the clouds. Nyetian was stunned for a moment. The shock in his heart was perfectly expressed through his trembling eyes. This sword shadow was tens of thousands of meters long. It was too huge and too terrifying. Jun Shujian and the other 6 were also completely shocked. Even though they were supreme swordsmen, they had never seen such a terrifying sword shadow before. It was hard to imagine how powerful the sacred heaven ancestor was back then. At this moment, the enormous sword shadow suddenly vibrated and then burst out with a sword hum. It turned into a boundless force that surged in the air. At this moment, everyone felt their hearts tremble at the same time. The sword intent in their bodies seemed to have gone out of control and suddenly surged out. The swordsmen who originally had sword spirits actually lost control of their sword spirits and directly came out, floating in the air. As far as the eye could see, the spectacular scene of Wan Jian floating in the air around Mount Shengtian turned out to be the sky. It was like 100 birds bowing to the phoenix, worshipping the emperor. The sword shadow on Mount Shengtian was the emperor of swords. All the swordsmen had to worship him. Only Nyetian and the others who were in the 7 origin sword array were less affected and could still control their own sword intent. However, the sensation caused by the sacred heaven sword shadow was far more than that. At the same time, the entire abandoned land. All the swordsmen felt an inexplicable throbbing at the same time. The sword intent in their bodies became restless, as if it was about to lose control. At the peak of a mountain, a figure in black stood. His face was slightly pale, and he looked surprised and shocked. He was none other than one of the 3 legendary swordsmen in the abandoned land, the Dark Knight Sword Sage, Anya Minjia. What's going on? Anya Minjia's eyes trembled, and he was greatly shocked. He felt that the sword intent in his body was being led by another sword intent. He had to concentrate in order to barely control the sword intent in his body. Chapter 2276. The sword intent in Anya Minjia's body was stirring restlessly. It was actually being led by another sword intent. He immediately thought of the reason. The activation of the sacred heaven sword seal. He reckoned that in the entire land of the abandoned, there were less than a handful of swordsmen who could stand shoulder to shoulder with him, and there was no one who could suppress him in terms of sword intent. Even the Sacred Heaven Sword Alliance Master was only slightly better than him. He could not suppress him at all. However, the sword intent that he felt now was far stronger than his own sword intent. He had heard that the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal of the Sacred Heaven Sword Alliance contained a supreme sword intent. After thinking about it, he believed that this sword intent could only come from the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal. The Sacred Heaven Sword Alliance has been established for 1,000,000 years, but no one has been able to activate the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal. But in the next moment, Anya Minjia frowned and said in a deep voice, "Could it be that the Sacred Heaven Sword Alliance has produced a peerless genius?" At the thought of this, he frowned and moved toward the Sacred Heaven mountain range. At the same time, in 2 other places in the land of the abandoned, 2 figures moved at the same time and also headed toward the Sacred Heaven Mountains. They were the other 2 legendary swordsmen, Guangwu Funyin and Sikong Shuani. What Anya Minjia could think of, the 2 of them could also think of. The activation of the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal was a major event that shook the entire sword world. As legendary swordsmen, how could they not go and see what was going on? At the same time, the 3 legends set off on the sacred sky peak. The eyes of the crowd trembled. They were completely shocked by the scene in front of them. They did not even understand why this was happening. The sword intent in their bodies was out of control and crazily gushed out. It was as if their bodies were no longer their own, which made them feel desperate. What's going on? Nyetian looked at the people outside the sword formation and the magnificent scene of tens of thousands of sword spirits floating in the air. His face sank as he asked in astonishment. The sword intent released by the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal is too strong. It's making their sword intent go out of control, Fat Cat said nervously. Fat, how long will this situation last? Nyetian forced himself to calm down and asked in a trembling voice. He was very worried that if this situation continued, these people's sword wills would dry up and they would die. After all, the sword intent within every swordsman's body was limited, and once it was exhausted, the swordsman would be in danger. It shouldn't last too long, right? Fat Cat wasn't too sure, her eyes twinkling as she said. Nyetian narrowed his eyes and couldn't help but look at the terrifying sword shadow on Mount Xingtian. The gigantic sword shadow constantly released majestic sword intent, as if it was declaring that it was the king of this world, and that it was going to dominate this world. This situation continued for half an hour, but there were no signs of it stopping. Just how much sword intent is contained in the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal? Why is it so terrifying? Nyetian frowned, his eyes trembling. He couldn't imagine that a sword seal actually contained such a huge sword intent. It was like an endless abyss of sword intent. This doesn't seem right. Fat Cat's voice sounded as if she had sensed something terrifying. Even her voice began to tremble. Fat, what's wrong? Nyetian's eyes narrowed as he asked nervously. He had already noticed that everyone's sword intent was almost exhausted. If this continued, some of the weaker swordsmen would be in danger. Nyetan, there seems to be not only sword intent sealed in the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal, but also something else, Fat Cat said in a deep voice, unable to hide the horror in her expression. There's something else sealed? Nyetian was stunned for a moment, and his eyes narrowed as he asked, What is it? It seems to be a sword spirit. Fat Cat's eyes flickered, and it was obvious that she was panicking. A sword spirit. Nyetian couldn't help but exclaim when he heard Fat Cat's words, and his expression stiffened. Never in his wildest dreams did he expect that the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal not only contained sword intent, but also a sword soul. Didn't that mean that the Sacred Heaven Ancestor had sealed his own sword spirit in the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal? Why would he do that? Boom! While Nyetian was still in a state of shock, the enormous sword shadow suddenly shook violently and then shot up into the sky like a raging dragon, rolling in the air. At this moment, everyone felt that the sword intent in their bodies had returned to normal, and they could finally control their own bodies. Before the crowd could calm down, in the next moment, they saw that the huge sword shadow was actually directly charging towards the 7 origin sword formation. Oh no! Seeing this, little Fat Cat cried out in fear, its voice becoming shrill. He had greatly underestimated the power of the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal, so the 7 origin sword formation couldn't withstand such a terrifying impact. Everyone, hold your positions. At this moment, Nyetian's eyes suddenly focused, and he roared. Jun Chujian and the others immediately reacted. They all knew that if they couldn't withstand this impact, there would only be one ending for them: death. The sword shadow was like a dragon, roaring in the void, and like a falling meteor, it fell towards the 7 origin sword formation. At this moment, the strangest scene happened. A bunch of ants. You want to break the sword seal that I left behind? Dream on. A majestic voice resounded in the void like thunder, causing everyone's mind to tremble. Sacred Heaven Ancestor. Nyetian was stunned for a moment, and he exclaimed in his heart. That majestic voice came from the sword shadow, and it was obviously from the sword spirit within the sword seal. Fat Cat was right. The Sacred Heaven Ancestor had indeed left a sword spirit within the Sacred Heaven Sword Seal. Ants die. Then the majestic voice resounded again, reverberating in the void with an incomparably violent, murderous intent. Oh no! Nyetian's pupils suddenly shrank, and his expression suddenly changed. The Sacred Heaven Ancestor's sword spirit actually wanted to kill them directly. The expressions of Jun, Chu Jian, and the others instantly froze, and their eyes uncontrollably revealed fear and despair. Don't give up. We must hold the 8 formation eyes of the 7 origin sword formation and block the impact of the sword shadow. At this moment, Niet Tion's voice resounded again, and it was unusually firm. Even in the face of this extreme situation, he still wouldn't give up. Jun Chujian and the others suddenly steadied themselves. Instantly, sword intent surged around them, causing the entire sword formation to madly revolve. The power of the formation circulated in the space, surging violently. An ant trying to shake a tree, don't overestimate yourself. In the void, the majestic voice resounded again, and then a huge sword shadow descended like a mountain. Rumble. In the next moment, the sword shadow descended on the 7 Origins sword formation, and a terrifying roar resounded. Bang! Crack, crack, crack. Then, the sound of an explosion resounded, and the barrier outside the 7 Origins sword formation suddenly shook and directly collapsed. That sword shadow was too terrifying, and its destructive power was not something that the 7 Origins sword formation could withstand. Niet Tion's eyes suddenly trembled, and his face instantly turned pale. This was a scene that he had not expected at all. Chapter 2277. The sudden turn of events stunned Jun, Chujian, and the rest. They had completely lost the courage to resist. The 7 Origin sword formation collapsed with a loud bang, and the boundlessly vast sword pressure rolled down. In the blink of an eye, Jun Chujian and the rest would be killed. I will never give up. At this moment, Niet Tion's voice was heard again. Even if the 7 Origin sword formation collapsed and death was right in front of him, he would not give up. Mighty God's sword formation opened. In the next moment, the blood chi and sword intent around him surged out at the same time. The strongest sword formation of the AO sword technique was formed. Almost at the same time, the boundless power of the stars was released wildly and merged perfectly with the mighty God sword formation. At this moment, the power around Niet Tion had reached the limit of what his martial body could withstand. At this moment, there was still some sword intent left in his body by Jun Chujian and the rest. However, he had lost the protection of the 7 Origin sword formation and could only use his martial body to withstand the terrifying sword intent. He did not care about any of this. He had done everything he could to fight for a glimmer of hope in the midst of despair. Onaino Jun Chujian and the rest looked at Niet Tion. Their eyes were filled with surprise, shock, and shame. Niet Tion was the weakest among them. However, at this moment, only Niet Tion was still resisting with all his might. The rest were stunned. They could not imagine how a person could have such strong courage. Niet Tion's willpower was so strong that it could not be destroyed. No matter what kind of enemy he was facing, he would not give up. Even if he died, he would fight to the last moment. The crowd in the distance was also stunned. Their expressions were so stiff that they were almost numb. Niet Tion's actions showed them what it meant to be fearless. One sword, God slaying. At this moment, Niet Tion's voice was heard. Then, the heavenly star slash appeared in his hand, and he slashed out. The terrifying sword intent condensed into a huge sword shadow and whizzed toward the top of his head. Kid, your courage is indeed frightening. Right at this moment, the deep and cold voice rang out again, reverberating in the air. Unfortunately, your enemy is me. You will soon understand that in the face of true power, no matter how strong your courage is, it will still turn into ashes. The cold voice was like the sigh of death, incomparably austere. The void was trembling, and so was the world. The space was filled with a tragic aura. Rumble. In the next moment, the 2 sword shadows collided, but it was clear who was stronger and who was weaker. Niet Tion's all-out strike was still unable to withstand a single blow from the Sacred Heavens Patriarch. The sword's shadow collapsed, and the sword will dispersed, surging powerlessly in the space. The gazes of the crowd seemed to have stopped at this moment, all focused on Niet Tion. They knew that everything was over. Whether it was Niet Tion or Jun Chujian and the others, they would all die once the sword shadow fell. However, at this moment of life and death, something strange happened again. This aura you are. Just as the sword shadow was less than 100 meters away from Niet Tion, the deep voice rang out again, this time with extreme surprise. It seemed that the sword spirit had discovered something on Yetion's body. Hum! The huge sword shadow let out a terrifying sword hum, then suddenly stopped in midair. Impossible! Why do you have? A strong voice sounded with great shock and even fear in it. This sudden scene made everyone's eyes tremble, and then they were dumbfounded. The scene changed too quickly, and no one could react at all. What was going on? Yetion was also stunned, his eyes cold as he looked at the sword shadow above his head with a puzzled expression. What had the sword spirit of the sacred heavens patriarch discovered? Why did it suddenly stop moving? Ha! Ha ha ha! I didn't see wrongly. You really are. The deep voice suddenly laughed wildly. It was very excited, like a dying person who had suddenly grasped a life-saving straw. What's going on? Yetion was puzzled. He couldn't figure out what had happened at all. Jun Chujian and the others were even more dumbfounded. Their mouths were wide open, but they couldn't make a sound. This may be the will of the heavens. Ha ha ha! Then the deep voice laughed wildly again. Then the gigantic sword shadow suddenly shook and shattered into pieces. It turned into 7 sword wheels and whizzed toward Jun Chujian and the other 7 people. Before Jun Chujian and the others could react, they were enveloped by the sword essences. What's going on? Jun Chujian and the others exclaimed. They immediately felt that the sword essences that had enveloped them were seeping into their bodies, turning into a gentle power that nourished them. In the next moment, Jun Chujian and the others realized that the sword spirit had actually taken the initiative to divide the sword essences into 7 parts for them to absorb. The few of them gasped. They didn't know why. The sword spirit of the sacred heavens patriarch had originally wanted to kill them. Why had it suddenly helped them? The 7 of you remember that you can live because the person in front of you saved your lives. Just as the 7 of them were puzzled, the deep voice rang out in the void again. Jun Chujian and the others were taken aback. Then they looked at Yetion with astonishment in their eyes. The sacred heavens patriarch hadn't killed them because of Yetion. What exactly had the sacred heavens patriarch found on Yetion? Why did he suddenly do such a strange thing? At this moment, not only were Jun Chujian and the others confused, but even Yetion couldn't figure it out. At this moment, an illusory figure appeared in the void. One could faintly make out that it was a human figure. The sacred heavens patriarch. Yetion's eyes trembled when he saw the illusory figure. He almost exclaimed. Clearly, this illusory figure was the sword spirit left behind by the sacred heavens patriarch. Jun Chujian and the others also saw the illusory light and shadow. They were stunned and speechless from the shock. Yetion's guess was correct. This illusory figure was the sword spirit of the sacred heavens patriarch. You're the strongest, so you should be the one to make the decision. At this moment, the sacred heavens sword spirit turned to Jun Chujian and said, "You must listen to what I'm about to say. Although the sacred heavens sword seal has been opened, no one is allowed to enter the sacred heavens sword tomb. The thing in the sacred heavens sword tomb is much more terrifying than you can imagine. Once that thing is released, it will destroy the entire Forsaken Land. From now on, the entire Mount Shengtian will be the biggest forbidden ground in the Forsaken Land. No one is allowed to take half a step inside. Do you understand?" Jun Chujian was stunned by the sacred heavens sword spirit's words. He didn't know what to say. The sacred heavens sword spirit seemed to be angry and roared. "I'm asking you if you understand." "Yes, I understand." Jun Chujian reacted and quickly nodded. "That's good." The sacred heavens sword spirit smiled and turned to Yetion. "I don't have much time left. This sword spirit is about to disappear. Future Sir Starry Sky, Holy Master, before this seat's sword spirit disappears, let this seat give you one more thing." Chapter 2278. The sacred heaven ancestor suddenly called Yetion, the future Star Sky Sacred Lord. Yetion was taken aback by this form of address. He didn't expect the sacred heaven ancestor to know the Star Sky Sacred Lord. Star Sky Sacred Lord. How did the sacred heaven ancestor know this name? Could he be In the next second, Nyetian suddenly thought of something and his expression changed. He was too shocked to say anything. There was only one explanation for the sacred heaven ancestor to call out the star sky, sacred Lord's name. He was the star sky messenger. The sacred heaven ancestor was the star sky messenger. This thought shocked Nyetian to the extreme. His entire body slightly trembled. He didn't expect the sacred heaven ancestor to be related to the star sky messenger. Star sky, sacred Lord. The sacred heaven sword soul couldn't help but laugh after seeing Nyetian's reaction. It seems like you know a lot and have already guessed my identity. I didn't expect that after so many years, the primal starstone really found a suitable candidate. Your appearance has really given me a huge surprise. Nyetian stared at the sacred heaven sword soul in a daze. His heart was filled with shock. At this moment, there was no doubt that the sacred heaven ancestor was the star sky messenger. Star sky, sacred Lord, are you ready? Next, the sacred heaven sword soul suddenly let out a strange smile. Its figure moved and turned into a ray of light, directly creating a strange space. Ready for what? Nyetian was stunned. He didn't have time to react and was directly sucked in by the strange space in front of him. He felt his mind tremble as he arrived in a strange space. What is this place? Nyetian looked around, astonishment in his eyes. This was a strange world. All around it was a boundless space, vast and boundless. Nyetian sensed that there was a mysterious power circulating in the air, which was like strands of energy that were constantly surging about. This invisible power gave him a very mysterious feeling. He couldn't tell what this power was. He couldn't see it, but he could clearly feel it. Star Saint Lord, this is the space of the three greats, sacred formation. At this time, the voice of the divine heaven ancestor appeared in the space. I don't have much time left, so I can't explain too much to you. How much you can comprehend will depend on yourself. With that, the voice and aura of the sacred heaven sword soul completely disappeared. Nyetian was the only one left in the entire space, along with the endless wisps of mysterious aura. Nyetian frowned. He didn't understand what the sacred heaven ancestor wanted him to comprehend. This space was isolated from everything. He couldn't even communicate with the fat cat. Just at this moment, a mighty voice boomed out from the void. It was boundlessly majestic, as though it was coming from the heaven and earth. Three talents, heaven, earth, and human. The Tao of heaven, the rhythm of earth, the heart of man. The tripartite sacred formation can sense the heavenly Tao, comprehend the rhythm of the earth, and form the heart of a saint. The mighty voice resounded in Nyetian's ears, causing him to fall into a very mysterious state. It was as if everything had disappeared, leaving him alone to communicate with the heaven and earth, to merge with the universe, and to comprehend yin and yang. Yin and yang of the heaven and earth, everything forgotten. Nyetian closed his eyes and forgot everything. He followed the operation of the three greats sacred formation and experienced the heaven, the rhythm of earth, and the human heart. He didn't know how long this mysterious state lasted. When he opened his eyes again, he had already returned to the original world. Everything that he had just experienced was like a dream, and it made him feel like he was intoxicated. And in front of him, the sacred heaven sword soul still hadn't disappeared. Star Saint Lord, what did you comprehend from the three greats sacred formation? The sacred heaven sword soul asked nervously after seeing that Nyetian had woken up. The three greats sacred formation was a natural sacred formation. It wasn't man-made, but was nurtured by the heaven and earth. The sacred heaven ancestor spent many years in the three greats sacred formation without any harvest. He was looking forward to what Nyetian could comprehend. Defy. Nyetian's eyes slightly trembled and the corner of his mouth twitched as he uttered this word. Defy. The sacred heaven sword soul was stunned and didn't understand what Nyetian meant. Nyetian, on the other hand, had completely calmed down and said, three greats, the heaven, the rhythm of earth, and the human heart. Whether it's the heaven, the rhythm of earth, or the human heart. If I can't use them, then I can only go against them. go against the heaven and earth. The sacred heaven sword soul was so shocked that even its voice changed. It originally thought that Nye Tian would definitely gain something after comprehending the three greats sacred formation. However, it never expected that Nye Tian would actually comprehend a word that it couldn't even dream of: defy. In the next moment, the sacred heaven sword soul seemed to have thought of something. Its eyes violently trembled as it exclaimed, "Defy the heaven, defy the earth, and defy the human heart. You are the legendary 9 Defiance." However, the sacred heaven sword soul's aura was too weak. Before it could finish its last sentence, it disappeared in the air. Hearing the sacred heaven sword soul's words, Nye Tian couldn't help but feel strange. He didn't know what the sacred heaven sword soul wanted to say at the end. Defy the heaven, defy the earth, and defy the human heart. There are only 3 Defiance, so why did the sacred heaven sword soul say 9 Defiance? What was after 9 Defiance? Onai Oni Tian was confused and shocked at the same time. Everything that happened just now had an extraordinary meaning to him. In the 3 great sword formation, he had seen a wider world. That world was something that he couldn't reach at the moment. "Nye Tian, are you all right?" Jun Chujian's voice sounded at this moment. He looked at Nye Tian with a strange expression. He didn't hear the conversation between Nye Tian and the sacred heaven sword soul because the sacred heaven sword soul had shielded the surrounding space. The 6 sect masters also came over and looked at Nye Tian with trembling and shocked eyes. For them, the opening of the sacred heaven sword seal this time was a great harvest. This was because they had successfully absorbed a portion of the sacred heaven sword intent. And all of this was thanks to Nye Tian. If it wasn't for Nye Tian, they would have died under the sacred heaven sword soul's sword shadow. Until now, they still didn't understand why the sacred heaven sword soul suddenly stopped and helped them instead. But there was no doubt that the sacred heaven sword soul and Nye Tian had an extraordinary relationship. "I'm fine." Nye Tian smiled faintly. The corner of his mouth curled up into a faint smile, and his eyes were filled with unconcealable joy. He didn't absorb the sacred heaven sword intent, so his strength didn't increase at all. But he obtained something that was 100 times more precious than the sacred heaven sword intent. When he comprehended the 3 greats sacred formation just now, he didn't just comprehend the word defiant. He also comprehended a set of sword techniques. That's right, a set of sword techniques. At this moment, he already had the basic outline of this sword technique in his divine sense. The corner of Nye Tian's mouth twitched as he said inwardly, "This sword incantation comes from the tricolored sacred formation, and I derive the word defy from it. I'll call it the sacred heaven defying sword." Sacred heaven defying sword. Nye Tian thought of the name of the sword technique, and the 3 sword techniques of the sacred heaven defying sword appeared in his divine sense. Human sword cutting the stars, earth sword swallowing the moon, and sky sword defying the sun. These 3 sword techniques were comprehended from the 3 greats sacred formation. But each sword technique focused on the word defiant. Nye Tian was very excited. He looked around and saw that everything was calm, so he prepared to leave. Boom! But at this moment, Mount Shangtian suddenly shook, and the entire mountain began to collapse. "Oh no! Mount Shangtian is going to collapse." Seeing this, Nye Tian exclaimed. Then, he recalled the words of the sacred heaven sword soul, and his face turned pale. Chapter 2279. Oh no! Seeing that Mount Shangtian was about to collapse, Jun Chujian's eyes trembled as he recalled the words of the sacred heaven ancestor. The sacred heaven ancestor specifically reminded him that even if the sacred heaven sword mound opened, no one was allowed to enter. Once the thing inside the sacred heaven sword mound was released, it would destroy the entire abandoned land. Although Jun Chujian didn't know what was inside the sacred heaven sword mound, he absolutely believed in the words of the sacred heaven ancestor. Mount Xingtian must have suffered too much from the sword intent just now and couldn't hold on anymore. The sacred heaven sword seal was broken, and the sword seal shield around Mount Shangtian was gone. If Mount Shangtian collapsed, then the sacred Heaven Sword Mound would be directly exposed to the outside world. If that was the case, protecting the sacred Heaven Sword Mound would be even more difficult. Lord Alliance Leader, we can't let Mount Shengtian collapse, Nie Tian said to Jun Chujian, knowing the importance of Mount Shengtian. Yes. Jun Chujian nodded, then looked at the 6 sect masters and shouted, Sect masters, we have received the grace of the sacred heaven ancestor. We must not let Mount Shengtian collapse. Finishing his words, he took a step forward and appeared outside of Mount Shengtian. The sword intent in his body surged out and turned into strands of power that enveloped the entire Mount Shengtian. Boom! The huge mountain was enveloped by the sword will and suddenly sank. Then the huge mountain stabilized. However, Mount Shengtian was extremely huge. It had a radius of a few thousand meters and a height of nearly 100,000 meters. It was easy to destroy such a huge mountain. However, it wasn't easy to stop it from collapsing. Boom! The huge mountain only stabilized for a moment, then shook again and began to collapse. When Luo, Tong, Ling Yi, and the other sect leaders saw this, they moved in unison. The 6 of them appeared beside Jun Chujian and released their sword intents at the same time, merging with Jun Chujian's sword intents. The sword wills of the 7 godly swordsmen converged, and like a giant hand, they forcibly stabilized the collapsing Mount Shengtian. Steady. It's stable. When the crowd outside saw this scene, they all cheered in surprise. Fortunately, they're here. Otherwise, Mount Shengtian would have been lost. Nie Tian let out a long sigh of relief. His lips curled into a faint smile. Following this, Jun Chujian and the others slowly stabilized Mount Shengtian and used their sword intents to slowly move the rocks in the mountain, stabilizing the entire mountain. After half an hour, Jun Chujian and the rest finally stabilized Mount Shengtian. At this moment, bean-sized beads of sweat had already appeared on their foreheads. Alliance Lord, you've all worked hard. Nie Tian came to the 7 of them and smiled. Jun Chujian and the rest nodded in response. They were also very happy to be able to stabilize Mount Shengtian. Who knew what terrifying things existed in the sacred Heaven Sword Tomb under Mount Shengtian? Once that terrifying thing came out, the Sacred Heaven Sword Alliance would be the first to suffer. QL 11-inch Nie Tian, let's return to the main hall first, Jun Chujian said to Nie Tian after confirming that Mount Shengtian was stabilized. Nie Tian nodded slightly. He wanted to be alone and study the sacred heaven-defying sword technique. However, Jun Chujian and the rest definitely had a lot of doubts in their hearts. There were some things that needed to be explained and confirmed. Jun Chujian let everyone disperse, leaving behind dozens of powerful swordsmen. He instructed them to guard Mount Shengtian and not allow anyone to get close. Anyone who dared to get close to Mount Shengtian was to be killed on the spot. A moment later, Nie Tian's group arrived at the Sacred Heaven Hall. In the hall, aside from Nie Tian, there were only Jun Chujian and the 6 sect masters. Alliance Lord, if you have any questions, just ask. Nie Tian didn't wait for Jun Chujian to speak. Nie Tian, what happened just now? Jun Chujian furrowed his brows and asked with burning eyes. The 6 sect masters also looked at Nie Tian with burning eyes, waiting for the latter to give an answer. Nie Tian shook his head and bitterly smiled. We made a wrong deduction about the sacred Heaven Sword Seal. Not only was there a sword seal in the seal, but there was also the sword soul of the sacred heaven ancestor. Sword soul. Jun Chujian and the rest were shocked. Even though they had already guessed it, they were still very surprised to hear it confirmed by Nie Tian himself. Nie Tian nodded and continued. I guess that the sacred heaven ancestor wanted to kill us because breaking the sacred heaven sword seal was equivalent to opening the gate of the sacred heaven sword tomb. He already said that there was something very terrifying inside the sacred heaven sword tomb, so we can't open it. Yes. Jun Chujian nodded and asked, what happened after that? Why did the sacred heaven ancestor suddenly change his mind and split the sword intent into 7 parts and gave it to the 7 of us? This was what surprised Jun Chujian and the others the most, and it puzzled them no matter how they thought about it. They knew that the sacred heaven ancestor did this because of Nyetian, but they didn't know the specific reason. Alliance Lord, I don't really understand this and can't tell you the reason. Nyetian shook his head and answered. The sacred heaven ancestor being a star messenger and the origin star stone were Nyetian's secrets that he wouldn't easily tell others. Jun Chujian frowned as if he knew that Nyetian was hiding something, but he didn't continue to ask. Alliance Lord, how do you feel now? At this time, Nyetian smiled and suddenly asked, I am fine. Jun Chujian obviously understood what Nyetian was asking and nodded with a smile. Nyetian was concerned about whether the sword scar on Jun Chujian's divine sword physique had recovered. A large part of the reason why Jun Chujian wanted to break the sacred heaven sword seal was to heal himself. Now, it seemed that Jun Chujian's internal injuries were already healed. The sacred heaven ancestor was indeed powerful. A single sword intent was enough to heal Jun Chujian. Sect leaders, congratulations on obtaining the sword intent of the sacred heaven ancestor. Nyetian looked at the 6 sect leaders and said, Mr. Nyetian, we were able to obtain this because of you. Roten was the first to stand up and loudly said, From now on, Sir Nyetian is Roten's benefactor. If Sir needs Roten's help, just say the word. I, Roten, am willing to go through fire and water for Sir. The other sect leaders were stunned at first after hearing Roten's words, but they immediately reacted and said, We are the same. We are willing to go through fire and water for Sir Nyetian. Sect leaders are too serious. Thank you for your respect. We'll be friends from now on. Nyetian smiled with a calm expression. The change in attitude of Roten's group could be said to be 180 degrees. However, Nyetian didn't find it strange at all. He was a smart person and naturally knew what Roten's group was thinking. It was true that Nyetian saved them when they were activating the sacred heaven sword seal earlier. However, this life-saving grace wasn't enough for Roten's group to be so grateful. What truly made them lower their heads to Nyetian was Nyetian's powerful strength, mysterious identity, and limitless potential. Everyone saw how fearless Nyetian was when facing the sacred heaven ancestor. One had to know that at that moment, even the divine sword masters were scared silly. However, Nyetian was still able to stand up and fight back. This kind of courage could only be described as abnormal. With such talent and perseverance, the future Nyetian would definitely be an expert standing at the peak. More importantly, they saw the attitude of the sacred heaven ancestor towards Nyetian. Even the sacred heaven ancestor changed his attitude because of Nyetian.